The knife flashed in the morning sunlight as Bobbie lunged, not at Patrick, but straight at Betty's heart. Time shattered into crystalline fragments of terror. Betty saw death coming for her in the twisted face of a man consumed by hatred, saw the blade that would end everything before it had truly begun. But Patrick moved like lightning given flesh. He threw himself between them, becoming a shield of bone and blood. The knife meant for Betty's heart found his instead, sliding between ribs with a wet final sound that silenced the entire pack. Patrick's golden eyes met hers for one impossible moment, not with pain, but with relief that she was safe. Then he collapsed. Betty's scream tore from her throat with a sound that had never been human, a cry of anguish that sent every wolf in the village to their knees. Silver light exploded from her skin like a dying star, washing over the platform in waves of pure divine energy. "Patrick!" She dropped beside his fallen form, her hands pressing against the wound that pulsed his life away with each weakening heartbeat. But the damage was too severe, the blood loss too extensive. Even her considerable healing abilities struggled against the reality of mortal injury. In desperation, Betty lifted her head toward the pale moon hanging in the morning sky. "Please," she whispered, her voice carrying across the sudden silence. "Moon Goddess, if you're listening, if this bloodline means anything to you, please don't let him die. I'll do anything. I'll serve anyone you want, go anywhere you command, just please don't take him from me." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Power poured down from the heavens like liquid starlight, flooding through Betty with an intensity that began burning away her mortality itself. To save him, she would have to become something more than human. She looked down at Patrick's fading features and knew she would pay any price. "I accept." Chapter 1. The Lunar Ceremony. The scent of pine and anticipation hung thick in the moonlit clearing. Betty's hands trembled as she smoothed her worn blue dress, the fabric soft from too many washings. Around her, the Silverfang Pack gathered in their ancient circle, wolves shifting restlessly beneath human skin. Tonight was the Lunar Pairing Ceremony. Tonight, the moon goddess would reveal destined mates. "Omegas to the inner circle," Elder Marcus commanded, his voice carrying across the clearing like thunder. Betty's heart hammered against her ribs. After 22 years of serving, cleaning, and staying invisible, she'd finally been called forward. The silver moonlight seemed to pull her toward the center where alphas and betas stood tall and proud. Her bare feet whispered against the forest floor. Each step felt like walking toward her fate, or her doom. "Look at her," someone whispered, "acting like she belongs with the ranked wolves." The word stung, but Betty kept walking. She'd learned long ago that showing pain only invited more of it. Bobbie stood near the front, his broad shoulders squared, dark hair catching the moonlight. He was everything an Omega could dream of, strong, handsome, second in command of the pack. And for one impossible moment 3 months ago, when he'd helped her carry supplies from the market, she'd thought she'd seen something soft in his eyes, something meant just for her. The moon goddess's silver light intensified, bathing the clearing in ethereal glow. Ancient magic stirred in the air, making Betty's skin tingle. The marking would begin soon, the sacred moment when fated pairs would feel the pull, the undeniable recognition of their other half. Elder Marcus raised his arms. "Let the moon choose. Let her light reveal what hearts already know." The light grew brighter, warmer. Betty closed her eyes and felt it wash over her like a gentle tide. When the tingling sensation centered on her chest, right over her heart, her eyes flew open. The silver thread of connection stretched across the clearing, shimmering and undeniable. It led straight to Bobbie. His eyes met hers, and for one breathless second, she saw recognition flash across his face. The mate bond, ancient and powerful, hummed between them like a living thing. Betty's lips curved into a tentative smile. After years of loneliness, years of believing she'd never find her place in the pack, the moon goddess had chosen her, had chosen them. But then Bobbie's expression changed. Recognition turned to horror. Wonder became disgust. The beautiful line of connection between them seemed to twist, growing dark and ugly in his eyes. He threw back his head and laughed. The sound shattered the sacred silence like breaking glass. It rolled across the clearing, bouncing off the ancient trees, growing louder and more cruel with each echo. The other pack members turned to stare, confusion rippling through the crowd. "You?" Bobbie's voice carried across the clearing for everyone to hear. "The moon goddess thinks I'd lower myself for an omega like you?" Betty's world tilted. The silver thread between them felt like a noose now, choking her with its unwanted truth. "This has to be a mistake," Bobbie continued, his laughter growing sharper. "A beta doesn't mate with pack servants. I don't claim broken things." The words hit her like physical blows. Broken things? Is that what she was? "Bobbie, please," she whispered, but her voice was lost under his continuing laughter. Other wolves began to chuckle, the sound spreading like a disease through the pack. Betty felt every eye on her, every whispered comment cutting deep. She actually thought, "Poor little Omega. How embarrassing." Betty's cheeks burned with shame. The mate bond still pulsed between them, but now it felt like mockery, the moon goddess's cruel joke. She turned to run, to flee back to the servants' quarters where she belonged, but Bobbie's voice stopped her cold. "I, Beta Bobbie of the Silverfang Pack, reject you, Betty Williams, as my mate. You are unworthy of my name, my rank, my protection. I cast you out from my heart forever." The formal rejection hit her like a physical blow. Betty stumbled, gasping as the mate bond tore apart inside her chest. It felt like her soul was being ripped in half, leaving jagged edges that bled invisible wounds. But it was the laughter that destroyed her completely. Bobbie's cruel amusement, echoed by dozens of pack members who'd watched her humiliation like entertainment. Tears blurred her vision. She had to get away, had to hide before she completely fell apart in front of everyone. That's when the temperature in the clearing dropped 10 degrees. "Enough!" The single word cut through the laughter like a blade. Every sound died instantly, as if the forest itself had been commanded to silence. Alpha Patrick stepped from the shadows at the edge of the clearing. Betty had seen him before, of course. Everyone in the pack knew their alpha, but she'd never been this close, never felt the raw power that rolled off him in waves. He was tall and lean, with golden eyes that seemed to see straight through to your soul. Dark hair fell across his forehead, and when he moved, it was with the fluid grace of a predator. Those golden eyes found hers across the clearing, and Betty's breath caught. There was something in his gaze, not pity, but recognition, as if he saw her, really saw her, for the first time. "If the beta finds his fated mate unworthy," Patrick's voice carried easily across the silent clearing, each word precise and deadly calm, "then perhaps his judgment is flawed." Bobbie's laughter died in his throat. "Alpha, You what?" Patrick's gaze shifted to Bobbie, and even from across the clearing, Betty could see the beta flinch. "You reject what the moon goddess has chosen? You mock her gifts?" "She's just an omega," Bobbie protested, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. "She has nothing to offer a ranked wolf." Patrick's expression didn't change, but the air grew colder still. Nothing to offer. It wasn't a question. The way he said it, low and dangerous, made it sound like a judgment. Then Alpha Patrick looked back at Betty, and something shifted in his eyes. Something that made her heart stutter in her chest. "If you find her so unworthy," he said to Bobbie, never breaking eye contact with Betty, "then I claim her myself." The clearing erupted. Gasps echoed through the pack. Someone dropped something that clattered against stone. A woman made a sound like a wounded animal, but Betty heard none of it. All she could see were those golden eyes. All she could feel was the unexpected warmth in them. "What?" Bobbie's voice cracked like a teenager's. Patrick finally looked away from Betty, turning that terrible, beautiful attention back to the beta who'd rejected her. "You heard me." The alpha's voice was soft now, but somehow that made it more frightening. "If she's so beneath your notice, so unworthy of protection, then she falls under mine." But you can't," Bobbie sputtered. "I can't what?" Patrick asked mildly. "Claim an unclaimed Omega? Last I checked, I'm alpha of this pack. That gives me certain privileges." The formal words hit Betty like another shock. An alpha claiming an Omega wasn't unheard of, but it was rare. Powerful. It meant protection, yes, but also possession. It meant she would belong to him completely. "She's nothing," Bobbie said desperately. "A servant. You don't understand." "I understand perfectly." Patrick's voice cut through the night like winter wind. "I understand that you just rejected your fated mate in front of the entire pack. I understand that you mocked the moon goddess's choice. And I understand that your loss is my gain." He stepped forward and the crowd parted before him like water. Each step brought him closer to Betty, who stood frozen in the center of the clearing like a deer caught in headlights. When he reached her, Patrick extended one hand. His fingers were long and elegant, but Betty could see the calluses that spoke of years wielding weapons. "Betty Williams," he said formally, his voice carrying to every corner of the clearing. "I, Alpha Patrick Stone of the Silverfang Pack, claim you under my protection. Will you accept?" Betty stared at his outstretched hand. This close she could smell him, pine and mountain air with something wild and dangerous underneath, something that made her wolf stir restlessly. She glanced back at Bobbie, who was staring at them both with his mouth hanging open. The pack watched in stunned silence, waiting to see what the rejected Omega would do. What choice did she have, really? Accept the Alpha's protection, or face the consequences of being a rejected, unclaimed Omega in a pack that had already made it clear what they thought of her. Betty placed her trembling hand in Patrick's. His fingers closed around hers, warm and strong and impossibly gentle. The moment their skin touched, something electric shot up her arm. Not the mate bond, that had been severed, but something else. Something that made her breath catch and her heart race. "I accept," she whispered. Patrick's lips curved in what might have been a smile. "Then it's done." He lifted their joined hands, displaying their connection to the watching pack. "Betty Williams is under my protection now. Anyone who harms her answers to me." The threat in his voice was unmistakable. Betty felt it sink into her bones like warmth, chasing away the cold humiliation of rejection. But as she looked around the clearing at the shocked faces, at Bobbie's pale expression of disbelief, she wondered what she'd just gotten herself into, and whether being claimed by the Alpha would save her or destroy her completely. Chapter 2: Laughter and Shame. The silence stretched like a wire about to snap. Betty's hand remained clasped in Patrick's, his fingers steady and warm while her entire world spun off its axis. The shocked faces of the pack blurred around her as whispers began to rise like smoke. Did he really just... The Alpha claimed her? This can't be happening. But it was Bobbie's expression that held her attention. The Beta stood frozen, his face cycling through emotions too fast to track. Shock, disbelief, and something that looked almost like panic. "Alpha." Elder Marcus stepped forward, his weathered face creased with concern. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately. The claiming of an Omega is a serious matter." "Indeed it is." Patrick's voice remained calm, but Betty felt his grip tighten slightly on her hand. Not painful, just possessive. "Which is why I've made my decision public, before the moon goddess and the pack. Betty Williams is mine now." The word mine sent an unexpected shiver down Betty's spine. She'd gone from rejected to claimed in the span of heartbeats, and her mind struggled to process the whiplash. "But she was my mate," Bobbie protested, finally finding his voice. The moon chose, and you rejected her choice." Patrick's golden eyes fixed on the Beta with laser intensity. "Quite publicly, if I recall. You called her unworthy, broken, cast her out from your heart forever." He paused, letting each word sink in. "Did you think there would be no consequences?" Bobbie's face flushed red. "I didn't think—" "No, you didn't think." Patrick's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried across the entire clearing. "You humiliated your fated mate in front of the pack. You mocked the moon goddess's gift. And now you're surprised that your actions have consequences?" Betty felt the pack's attention like a physical weight. Some faces showed sympathy, others confusion, but too many held the same dismissive expression she'd seen her entire life. To them, she was still just the Omega who cleaned their houses and served their food. "She's nothing special," a voice called out from the crowd. Betty couldn't see who spoke, but the words hit like arrows. "Why would the Alpha want pack scraps?" The temperature dropped another few degrees. Patrick's free hand clenched into a fist at his side, and Betty felt dangerous energy radiating from him like heat from a forge. "Did someone just call my Omega scraps?" His voice was silk over steel, beautiful and terrifying. The crowd shifted uneasily. No one wanted to admit to insulting the Alpha's choice, but the damage was done. "I'm not your Omega," Betty said quietly, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Patrick's attention snapped to her, and she immediately regretted speaking. Those golden eyes seemed to see straight through her, reading secrets she didn't even know she carried. "Aren't you?" he asked softly. "You accepted my claim." "I accepted your protection," she corrected, trying to find some backbone. "That's different." Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, maybe even approval. "Is it?" Before Betty could answer, Bobbie stepped forward. "This is insane. You can't just claim her because I rejected her. There are rules." "Whose rules?" Patrick asked mildly. "The pack follows my laws, Beta, and my law says that any unclaimed Omega can be protected by ranked wolves. She's unclaimed, thanks to you." "She was my mate," Bobbie repeated stubbornly. "Was." Patrick emphasized the past tense. "Your choice. Live with it." The casual dismissal made Bobbie's face turn an alarming shade of purple. "You're making a mistake. She's weak, useless. She'll only drag you down." "Enough!" The single word cracked like a whip. Several pack members actually stepped backward, and Betty felt the Alpha's power wash over the clearing like a tide. This was what true dominance felt like, not bullying or shouting, but simple, undeniable authority. "You've said quite enough about my Omega for one evening," Patrick continued conversationally. "In fact, I think you've said quite enough in general." Bobbie's mouth opened and closed like a fish. The rest of the pack watched with fascination and growing unease as their Beta was systematically dismantled by their Alpha. "Now," Patrick said, turning back to Betty without releasing her hand. "I believe the ceremony is over. Betty, you'll come with me." It wasn't a request. Betty felt the pack's eyes burning into her back as Patrick began to lead her toward the edge of the clearing. Each step felt monumental, carrying her away from the only life she'd ever known and towards something completely unknown. "Wait." Bobbie's voice cracked like breaking glass. "Please, Alpha, don't do this. Not for her." Patrick stopped walking but didn't turn around. "Give me one good reason why not." Bobbie was quiet for so long that Betty thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was small and desperate. "Because she doesn't deserve you." The words hung in the air like a curse. Betty felt them sink into her chest, joining all the other cruel things that had been said about her over the years. Maybe he was right. Maybe she didn't deserve kindness, or protection, or anything good at all. But then Patrick turned around, and the look in his eyes made Betty's breath catch. "No," he said quietly. "She doesn't deserve me. She deserves better." The simple statement hit Betty like a physical blow. Not cruel, not mocking, just matter-of-fact acceptance that she had value, that she was worth something. When was the last time anyone had said something like that about her? She deserves a mate who sees her worth, Patrick continued, his voice carrying across the silent clearing, who protects instead of destroys, who builds up instead of tears down. His gaze found Bobbie's. She deserves better than you. The beta flinched as if he'd been slapped. Around them, the pack murmured in shock. No one spoke to Bobbie like that. He was second in command, powerful and respected, but not more powerful than their alpha. Come, Patrick said to Betty, tugging gently on her hand. We're done here. This time, no one tried to stop them. As they walked toward the forest path that led to the alpha's territory, Betty heard the whispers start up behind them like rustling leaves. Can you believe? The alpha and an omega? She must have bewitched him. This won't end well. Each comment was a small knife, but Betty found they hurt less with Patrick's solid presence beside her. His hand was still wrapped around hers, steady and warm, anchoring her to this new reality. They walked in silence through the moonlit forest, their footsteps muffled by pine needles and moss. Betty kept stealing glances at the man beside her, trying to understand what had just happened. Why had he claimed her? It couldn't be attraction. Alphas didn't want omegas like her. It couldn't be the mate bond. That had been between her and Bobbie, and it was broken now. So why? You're thinking very loudly, Patrick observed without looking at her. Betty flushed. I'm sorry. I don't understand why you did that. Did what? Claimed me, protected me. I'm nobody. Patrick stopped walking so suddenly that Betty stumbled. His hands came up to steady her shoulders, and suddenly she was close enough to see the flecks of amber in his golden eyes. Don't, he said quietly. Don't ever call yourself nobody. But I am, Betty protested. I'm just an omega. I clean houses and serve food and what? Patrick's voice was soft but intense. That makes you worthless? That makes you deserve public humiliation? Betty's throat closed up. When he put it like that, it sounded ridiculous. But the pack's treatment had worn her down over the years, made her believe that maybe she really was as unimportant as they said. I've watched you, Patrick continued, his thumbs brushing over her shoulders in an absent gesture that made her shiver. For years, I've watched you take care of everyone else. I've seen your kindness, your strength. Do you think I'd claim someone I considered worthless? The question hung between them, heavy with implication. Betty searched his face for some sign that he was lying, or mocking her, or playing some game she didn't understand. All she saw was sincerity. I don't understand, she whispered. Patrick's lips curved in a small smile. You will. He released her shoulders and took her hand again, leading her deeper into the forest toward whatever came next. Behind them, the clearing fell silent except for the whisper of wind through leaves and the distant sound of the pack dispersing. But Betty could still feel their judgment following her like a shadow, reminding her that claiming was only the beginning. Now, she had to figure out how to survive being the alpha's omega in a pack that already hated her. Chapter 3. The Alpha's Claim. The Alpha's house materialized from the shadows like something from a fairy tale. If fairy tales included fortress-like stone walls and windows that watched the forest with dark, unblinking eyes. Betty had never been this deep into Alpha territory before. Omegas weren't allowed here without explicit permission, and she'd certainly never had reason to visit. Now, following Patrick up the winding stone path, she felt like she was walking into another world entirely. It's bigger than I thought, she said, immediately regretting the words. Of course it was big. He was the alpha. Everything about him would be larger than life. I don't entertain much, Patrick replied, fishing a key from his pocket. Most pack business is handled at the meeting hall. The front door was solid oak, carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift in the moonlight. Patrick's key turned with a soft click, and then he was ushering her inside. The entryway took Betty's breath away. Polished stone floors reflected the warm light from wrought iron fixtures, and a staircase swept upward like something from a magazine. Everything was clean lines and understated elegance, beautiful but not flashy. "Come," Patrick said, closing the door behind them. "You look like you could use a drink." He led her through an archway into a living room dominated by a massive stone fireplace. Comfortable leather furniture was arranged around a low coffee table, and floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the forest. It was warm and inviting in a way Betty hadn't expected. "Sit," Patrick instructed, gesturing to the couch. "I'll get us something." Betty perched on the edge of the sofa, too nervous to fully relax. The leather was butter-soft beneath her hands, probably worth more than she made in a year. Everything in this room spoke of wealth and power, things that had never been part of her world. Patrick returned with 2 glasses of amber liquid. He handed one to Betty and settled into the chair across from her, close enough to talk but far enough away that she didn't feel crowded. "Drink," he said simply. Betty took a tentative sip and immediately started coughing. Whatever it was burned like liquid fire going down her throat. "Whiskey," Patrick explained, and she caught what might have been amusement in his voice. "It helps with shock." "I'm not in shock," Betty protested weakly. Patrick raised an eyebrow. "No? You were rejected by your fated mate, publicly humiliated, and claimed by your alpha all in the span of 10 minutes. If that doesn't qualify as shock-inducing, I don't know what does." When he put it like that, Betty supposed he had a point. She took another, more careful sip of whiskey and felt warmth spread through her chest. "Why did you do it?" she asked quietly. "Do what?" "Don't pretend you don't know." Betty met his eyes, trying to find some trace of deception. "You could have anyone. Any unmated female in the pack would be honored to be claimed by you. So why me?" Patrick was quiet for a long moment, swirling the whiskey in his glass. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "Do you know what I see when I watch the pack during gatherings?" Betty shook her head. "I see politics, maneuvering, everyone trying to position themselves for maximum advantage." He took a sip of whiskey. "I see people who smile to my face and calculate how to use me behind my back." "That's terrible," Betty said softly. "That's leadership," Patrick corrected with a slight shrug. "It comes with the territory." "But you know what I don't see very often?" "What?" "Genuine kindness. Someone who helps others because it's the right thing to do, not because they expect something in return." His golden eyes found hers. "Someone who takes care of the elderly pack members even when no one's watching, who makes sure the children get extra food when supplies are low, who works twice as hard as anyone else and never complains." Betty's cheeks flushed. Anyone would do those things. Would they? Patrick's voice was gentle but skeptical. "Because I've been watching for years, and I've only seen one person consistently put others' needs before her own." The compliment made Betty's chest tight with an emotion she couldn't name. No one had ever noticed her small acts of kindness before. She'd thought they were invisible. "That still doesn't explain why you claimed me," she pointed out. Patrick set down his glass and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. The position brought him closer, close enough that she could see the intensity in his expression. "Maybe I'm tired of politics and positioning. Maybe I want someone real for once." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Maybe I saw what happened tonight and realized I couldn't let you walk away believing you're worthless." The words hit Betty like a physical blow. She'd been telling herself the same lie for so long that hearing someone call it out was almost painful. "I am worthless," she whispered. "My own fated mate rejected me in front of everyone. That has to mean something. It means he's an idiot." The flat certainty in Patrick's voice made Betty blink in surprise. "Bobbie is ambitious and insecure," Patrick continued matter-of-factly. "He's spent his entire life trying to prove he's worthy of his rank. Taking an Omega mate, even his fated one, would be seen as weakness by some of the pack. So he chose his reputation over his mate. But nothing. Patrick's eyes flashed with something dangerous. The moon goddess doesn't make mistakes, Betty. If she chose you for him, it's because you're exactly what he needs. His loss. The simple statement made something warm unfurl in Betty's chest. She'd never thought about it that way before, that maybe the rejection said more about Bobbie than it did about her. What happens now? She asked quietly. Now you live here, under my protection. Patrick sat back in his chair, but his gaze never left her face. The pack will adjust. They'll have to. And if they don't? Patrick's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. Then they'll learn why crossing an alpha is a bad idea. The quiet threat should have frightened Betty, but instead it made her feel safe. When was the last time someone had been willing to fight for her? I should warn you, she said hesitantly. I don't know how to be an alpha's omega. I've never been claimed before. I don't know what you expect from me. Something softened in Patrick's expression. I expect you to be yourself. Nothing more, nothing less. But what does that mean? Do you want me to cook for you? Clean? I can do those things, but I don't know what the rules are. Patrick was quiet for so long that Betty started to worry she'd said something wrong. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. Betty, do you think I claimed you to be my housekeeper? I don't know, she admitted. I don't know why you claimed me at all. Patrick set down his whiskey glass and stood up. For a moment, Betty thought he was going to leave, but instead he moved to the window, staring out at the moonlit forest. When I was younger, he said quietly, I thought being alpha meant having power over others, making decisions, giving orders, being obeyed without question. He paused. It took me years to understand that real power isn't about control. It's about protection, about creating a space where the people under your care can thrive. Betty watched the line of his shoulders, the way moonlight caught in his dark hair. There was something vulnerable about his posture that made her chest ache. Tonight, I watched one of my pack members destroy something precious, Patrick continued. I watched him take the moon goddess's gift and throw it away like garbage. And I realized that if I let that stand, if I let you walk away believing you deserved that treatment, then I'd failed as an alpha. He turned back to face her, and the intensity in his golden eyes made Betty's breath catch. I didn't claim you to be my servant, Betty. I claimed you because you deserve better, because you deserve someone who sees your worth. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. And maybe because I need someone real in my life more than I realized. The admission hung between them like a bridge, fragile and precious and absolutely terrifying. I don't know how to be real, Betty whispered. I've spent so long being invisible that I'm not sure who I am when people are actually looking. Patrick's lips curved in a small, genuine smile. Then I guess we'll figure it out together. The promise in his words made something flutter in Betty's chest. Hope, maybe, or the beginning of trust. She'd gone from rejected to claimed to whatever this was in the span of a few hours. But looking at Patrick, seeing the sincerity in his eyes, Betty thought that maybe, just maybe, she was finally exactly where she belonged, even if she had no idea what came next. Chapter 4. The fortress of Stone Dawn crept through the massive windows of Patrick's estate like a hesitant visitor, casting long shadows across marble floors that reflected Betty's uncertain footsteps. She'd barely slept, tossing restlessly on the enormous four-poster bed in the guest room Patrick had shown her to, a room larger than the entire servants' quarters she'd called home for 22 years. The morning light revealed details she'd missed the night before. Tapestries lined the walls depicting ancient wolves running beneath silver moons. Every surface was polished to perfection, from the gleaming hardwood floors to the crystal chandelier that hung like a frozen waterfall above the main staircase. Betty descended those stairs carefully, her bare feet silent against the cold stone. She'd tried to make herself invisible, a skill perfected through years of serving the pack, but the house seemed to amplify her presence instead of hiding it. "Good morning." Patrick's voice startled her so badly she nearly stumbled. He stood in the doorway of what looked like a kitchen, already dressed in dark jeans and a cream-colored sweater that made his golden eyes seem to glow. "I didn't know you were awake," Betty said, fighting the urge to smooth down her rumpled dress. She probably looked like she'd been dragged through the forest backwards. "I'm always up before dawn." Patrick stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter the kitchen. "Habit from patrol duties. Coffee?" The kitchen was as impressive as the rest of the house. Gleaming granite countertops, professional-grade appliances, and enough space to feed an army. But it was the warmth that struck her most. Unlike the formal elegance of the rest of the house, this room felt lived in. "I can make it," Betty offered automatically. "I don't mind." "Sit." Patrick's voice was gentle but firm. "You're not my servant, Betty." She perched on one of the bar stools at the kitchen island, watching as he moved with practiced efficiency. His hands were steady as he measured coffee grounds, and Betty found herself staring at the way his shoulders moved beneath the soft fabric of his sweater. "Did you sleep at all?" he asked without turning around. Betty flushed. "A little. The bed is very comfortable." Patrick glanced over his shoulder and something flickered in his expression. "But? It's just different," Betty admitted. "Everything here is so—" She gestured helplessly at the opulence surrounding them. "Cold?" Patrick suggested. "Beautiful," Betty corrected softly. "Like a castle from one of the storybooks I used to read to the Pack children." Something softened in Patrick's face. "And you don't feel like you belong in castles?" It wasn't a question. Betty nodded anyway, dropping her gaze to her hands. The coffee maker hissed and bubbled, filling the silence between them. When Patrick finally spoke again, his voice was carefully neutral. "The Pack will expect to see you today, at the morning assembly." Betty's stomach clenched. "Do I have to?" "Yes." Patrick poured coffee into 2 mugs, sliding one across the granite island to her. "You're under my protection now. That means you're part of my household. The Pack needs to understand that you're not going anywhere." The finality in his voice made Betty's chest tight. Not going anywhere. The words should have been comforting, but they felt more like a cage clicking shut. "What if they—" She started, then stopped. "What if they what?" Betty wrapped her hands around the warm mug, drawing comfort from its heat. "What if they don't accept me? What if they think I don't belong here?" Patrick was quiet for so long that Betty looked up, meeting his golden eyes across the kitchen island. When he spoke, his voice was low and dangerous. "Then they'll learn to keep their opinions to themselves." The threat was unmistakable. Betty shivered, but not from cold. "You can't fight the entire Pack for me," she pointed out. Patrick's lips curved in what might have been a smile, but there was no warmth in it. "Watch me." Before Betty could respond, a sharp knock echoed through the house. Patrick's expression immediately shifted, becoming alert and wary. "Stay here," he instructed, already moving toward the front door. Betty heard voices in the entryway, Patrick's low rumble and another voice she recognized with a sinking heart. Jason, Patrick's beta lieutenant. The conversation was too quiet to make out words, but the tone was urgent. When Patrick returned, his face was carved from stone. "What is it?" Betty asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. "The Pack is unsettled," Patrick said carefully. "About last night." "Unsettled how?" Patrick's jaw tightened. "There are questions about the claiming. Some of the elders want to meet with me privately to discuss the implications." Betty's stomach dropped. "They think I'm not worthy of being claimed by you." "They think a lot of things." Patrick's voice was sharp enough to cut glass. "None of which matter." But they did matter. and Betty could see it in the tension lines around Patrick's eyes. The pack's disapproval wasn't just gossip, it was a threat to his leadership. "Maybe this was a mistake," Betty said quietly. "Maybe you should—" "Should what?" Patrick's voice cracked like a whip. "Unclaim you? Throw you back to the wolves who spent 22 years treating you like dirt? If it would save your position?" "My position?" Patrick laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Betty, I am the alpha. I don't keep my position by bowing to pressure from elders who've never had to make a hard decision in their lives." The fierce protectiveness in his voice made Betty's chest warm, but it also terrified her. How much was he willing to risk for someone he barely knew? "I need to go handle this," Patrick continued, setting down his untouched coffee. "You stay in the house today. Don't answer the door. Don't go outside." "You're locking me up?" The words came out sharper than Betty intended. Patrick paused in the doorway, his shoulders tensing. "I'm keeping you safe." "Is there a difference?" For a moment, Patrick looked like he was going to argue. Then his expression shuddered, becoming the mask of cold authority she'd seen him wear with the pack. "Today there isn't," he said flatly. "I'll be back this evening. We'll talk then." He left without another word, and Betty heard the front door close with a finality that echoed through the empty house. She was alone in the Alpha's fortress, surrounded by luxury and trapped by protection she'd never asked for. And outside, she could feel the weight of the pack's judgment pressing against the walls like a gathering storm. Chapter 5. The Silent War. The house felt like a mausoleum after Patrick left. Betty wandered the empty rooms, her footsteps echoing off polished floors and vaulted ceilings. Every surface gleamed with wealth she could never have imagined. Hand-carved furniture that probably cost more than most pack members made in a year. Artwork that belonged in museums. Windows that offered breathtaking views of the forest that she was no longer allowed to enter. It was beautiful. It was prison. By noon, the silence had become oppressive. Betty had tried reading. Patrick's library was extensive and impressive. But she couldn't focus on the words. Her mind kept circling back to the morning assembly, to whatever Patrick was facing because of her. She was staring out the living room window when she saw the first figure at the edge of the tree line. A woman in a faded green dress, standing just beyond the boundary of Patrick's territory. Watching the house with obvious curiosity, Betty recognized her, Margaret, one of the pack mothers who sometimes came to the kitchens for extra supplies. Within an hour, there were 3 more figures scattered through the forest, all keeping their distance but all clearly there for the same reason: to see the Omega who'd bewitched their Alpha. Betty stepped back from the window, her heart racing. They weren't technically on Patrick's property, but their presence felt like a violation, like being studied by predators deciding whether she was worth the hunt. The phone rang, startling her so badly she knocked over a decorative vase. Her hands shook as she caught it before it could shatter on the marble floor. "Hello?" she answered hesitantly. "Is this the Alpha's new pet?" Betty's blood chilled. The voice was female but unfamiliar, cold and mocking. Who is this?" "Someone who knows what you really are." The woman's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "Did you think we wouldn't see through your little act? Poor little Omega, so sweet and helpless. But we know better." "I don't know what you're talking about," Betty whispered. "Of course you don't. Just like you don't know how you managed to bewitch our Alpha, how you made him claim a worthless servant over any of the ranked females who would have been honored to stand at his side." Each word was a knife, cutting deep into wounds that had barely begun to heal. "That's not— I didn't bewitch anyone," Betty protested weakly. "No? Then explain how you went from rejected trash to the Alpha's claimed in one night. That kind of reversal doesn't happen naturally, little Omega. It takes power, dark power." The line went dead, leaving Betty standing in the echoing silence with her hands trembling around the phone. Witchcraft. They thought she'd used magic to manipulate Patrick. The idea was so absurd it would have been laughable if it weren't so terrifying. Betty had never shown any unusual abilities, never demonstrated anything beyond the basic wolf senses they all shared. But fear and jealousy had their own logic, and a pack looking for someone to blame wouldn't let facts get in their way. Betty set the phone down with shaking hands and returned to the window. The figures in the forest had multiplied. She counted at least 8 now, scattered through the trees like sentinels. All watching, all waiting. The afternoon dragged by with agonizing slowness. More phone calls came, some silent, some filled with whispered threats and accusations. Betty stopped answering after the 5th call, but the ringing continued at irregular intervals, a constant reminder that she was not welcome in the pack's eyes. As sunset approached, Betty found herself pacing the length of the living room, her anxiety building with each passing hour. Where was Patrick? What was taking so long? Had the elders convinced him that claiming her had been a mistake? The front door opened with a soft click, and Betty spun around so fast she nearly tripped over her own feet. Patrick stood in the doorway, and one look at his face told her everything she needed to know. His jaw was tight, his golden eyes stormy, and tension radiated from every line of his body. "How did it go?" Betty asked, though she already knew the answer. Patrick closed the door behind him and leaned against it, suddenly looking exhausted. "About as well as expected," he said dryly. "The elders are concerned about the precedent my claiming might set. They're worried that other ranked wolves might start choosing mates based on attraction rather than political advantage. Heaven forbid," Betty muttered. Patrick's lips twitched in what might have been amusement under different circumstances. "They've also heard rumors about your supposed supernatural influence." Betty's stomach dropped. "The witchcraft accusations. You've heard them too?" "Phone calls, all afternoon." Betty wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold. "They think I bewitched you." Patrick pushed away from the door and crossed the room in 3 quick strides. His hands settled on her shoulders, warm and steady. "Look at me," he commanded softly. Betty reluctantly met his eyes. "I don't give a damn what they think," Patrick said firmly. "Do you understand? Their opinions don't matter. Their approval doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is that you're safe. But your position is secure." Patrick's voice brooked no argument. "I've been alpha for 8 years, Betty. I've led this pack through territory disputes, resource shortages, and 3 separate challenges to my authority. I'm not going to be brought down by a bunch of gossiping elders who can't accept that their alpha made a choice they didn't approve." The fierce certainty in his voice should have been reassuring. Instead, it made Betty feel like she was drowning. "You shouldn't have to fight them because of me," she whispered. Something flickered in Patrick's eyes. Surprise, maybe, or confusion. "What else would I fight them for?" The question hung between them, heavy with implication. Betty stared up at him, at this powerful man who'd turned his entire world upside down for someone he barely knew, and felt the weight of obligation settle around her shoulders like a chain. "I saw them today," she said instead of answering. "In the forest, watching the house." Patrick's hands tightened on her shoulders. "How many?" 8, maybe 10. They stayed at the tree line, but..." Betty shivered. "They were definitely watching." Patrick's expression darkened. "I'll have Jason post guards. No one gets close to this house without permission." "More guards means more pack members who'll resent me," Betty pointed out. "I don't care." But Betty could see in his eyes that he did care. The pack's unity mattered to him, and she was driving a wedge straight through the heart of it. "Maybe I should leave," she said quietly. Patrick went very still. "Leave and go where?" "I don't know. Another territory, maybe. Somewhere I won't cause problems for you." "Over my dead body." The words were spoken so quietly they were barely more than a whisper, but they carried the force of an avalanche. Betty took a step back, startled by the intensity in Patrick's voice. "You're mine now," he continued, his golden eyes blazing. "Under my protection. In my care. Do you think I'd let you walk away to face the world alone? I've been alone my whole life, Betty protested. I can take care of myself. Not anymore. Patrick's voice was implacable. You accepted my claim, Betty. That means something. It means I'm responsible for your safety, your well-being, your happiness, and I take my responsibilities very seriously. The possessive edge to his voice made something flutter in Betty's chest, part fear, part something else she didn't want to name. What if I don't want to be your responsibility? She asked. Patrick studied her face for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then you should have thought of that before you put your hand in mine. The words stung, though Betty couldn't say exactly why. Maybe because they were true. Maybe because they reminded her that this arrangement, whatever it was, had been her choice as much as his. I should check the perimeter, Patrick said abruptly, stepping away from her. Make sure our watchers have moved on. He was at the door before Betty found her voice. Patrick? He paused, hand on the doorknob, but didn't turn around. Thank you, she said quietly, for fighting for me, even if I don't understand why you're doing it. Patrick's shoulders tensed. For a moment, Betty thought he was going to say something, but then he simply nodded once and stepped out into the gathering darkness. Betty stood alone in the vast living room, surrounded by luxury and protection she'd never asked for, and wondered if she'd just made the biggest mistake of her life. Outside, she could feel the pack's hostility like a living thing, pressing against the walls of her gilded cage. And somewhere in the forest, she knew they were still watching. Chapter 6. The Alpha's Warning. 3 days later, the whispers had turned to roars. Betty woke to the sound of voices outside. Angry, agitated voices that carried through the early morning air like the buzz of hornets. She crept to the bedroom window and peered through the curtains to see a cluster of pack members at the edge of Patrick's territory. They weren't hiding anymore. Not natural, what she's done to him. Alpha hasn't been seen for 2 days. Locked up in there with that creature. Betty jerked away from the window, her heart pounding. The voices were getting bolder, the accusations more direct. And Patrick? Where was Patrick? She hadn't seen him since the night he'd left to check the perimeter. He'd returned late, but he'd avoided her since then, disappearing into his study before dawn, and not emerging until after she'd gone to bed. Betty had caught glimpses of him, a shadow in the hallway, the sound of his voice talking quietly on the phone. But it was like living with a ghost. A very deliberate, very distant ghost. The front door slammed, and Betty heard Patrick's voice in the entryway, low and furious. She crept to the top of the stairs, straining to hear. Told you to keep them back. I've tried, Alpha. Jason's voice was tight with frustration. But they're not technically on your property. They have a right to stand in pack territory. They have a right to mind their own damn business, Patrick snarled, which they seemed to have forgotten. The elders are calling for another meeting, Jason said carefully. Elder Marcus wants to discuss the situation, formally. The situation? Patrick's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. Is that what we're calling it now? Patrick, you have to understand their position. The pack is unsettled. There are rumors. There are always rumors. Patrick's footsteps paced across the marble floor. What kind of rumors? Jason hesitated. Dark magic. Manipulation. Some are saying she's not what she appears to be. Betty's blood turned to ice. They were talking about her like she was some kind of monster. And what do you think? Patrick asked quietly. The silence stretched so long that Betty thought Jason wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful, diplomatic. I think you've been different since the claiming, more isolated, more protective. Some might say obsessed. Obsessed? Patrick repeated the word like it tasted bitter. I'm not saying I believe the rumors, Jason said quickly, but I am saying that the pack is concerned about your welfare. They want to know that their alpha is still thinking clearly. Betty sank down on the top step, wrapping her arms around her knees. This was exactly what she'd feared. Patrick's defense of her was making him look weak, compromised, unfit to lead. "Schedule the meeting," Patrick said abruptly. "This afternoon, I'll address their concerns." "Are you sure that's wise? Maybe we should wait until things calm down." "They're not going to calm down, Jason. Not until I make it clear that questioning my judgment is a dangerous game to play." The threat in Patrick's voice made Betty shiver. She could practically feel the tension radiating through the house, thick and suffocating. "And the Omega?" Jason asked quietly. "What about her?" "The elders want to examine her, to determine if there's any truth to the claims about her abilities." Betty bit back a gasp. "Examine her? Like some kind of specimen?" "Absolutely not." Patrick's voice was flat and final. "Betty stays out of this." "Patrick, be reasonable. If she submits to examination and they find nothing unusual, it could put the rumors to rest. Or it could give them an excuse to declare her dangerous and demand her exile." Patrick cut him off. "I won't risk her safety to appease a bunch of paranoid old men." "Then what's your solution?" Jason's voice was getting strained. "Because right now, you look like an alpha who's lost his objectivity, who's been compromised by a female he barely knows." The silence that followed was arctic. "Get out," Patrick said very quietly. "Patrick, I said get out, before I forget that you're my friend and remember that you just accused me of being a fool." Betty heard the front door open and close, followed by the sound of Patrick's footsteps pacing across the marble floors. She should go back to her room, pretend she hadn't heard any of it. But something kept her frozen on the stairs, listening to the alpha's restless movement below. "I know you're there." Patrick's voice drifted up the stairwell, resigned rather than angry. Betty cringed but didn't move. "You might as well come down." Betty descended the stairs slowly, her bare feet silent on the cold marble. Patrick was standing in the living room with his back to her, staring out the window at the crowd of pack members that had grown larger since morning. "How much did you hear?" he asked without turning around. "Enough." Betty's voice came out smaller than she'd intended. "They want to examine me." Patrick's shoulders tensed. "That's not going to happen." "Maybe it should." Now Patrick did turn around, and the look in his golden eyes made Betty take a step backward. "Explain," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. Betty lifted her chin, trying to find some courage. "If I let them examine me and they find nothing, maybe they'll leave us alone. And if they decide you're dangerous anyway, if they claim you're hiding your abilities, if they use the examination as an excuse to hurt you?" Patrick's voice was getting sharper with each question. "What then, Betty?" "Then at least you'll be free of me," she said quietly. Patrick went very still. "What did you just say?" "You heard me." Betty met his eyes, trying to ignore the way his stare made her feel like she was standing on the edge of a cliff. "This is destroying your leadership. Your own beta thinks you've lost your mind. How long before the pack decides they need a new alpha?" "Let them try," Patrick said softly, and there was something in his voice that made the hair on Betty's arm stand up. "You can't fight the entire pack," Betty protested. "I can do whatever I damn well please. I'm the alpha." "Not if they remove you from power." The words hung in the air between them, stark and brutal. Patrick stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Is that what you want?" he asked quietly. "For them to remove me?" "No!" The word tore from Betty's throat. "I want you safe. I want the pack united. I want—" She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "What?" Patrick stepped closer, his golden eyes intense. "What do you want, Betty?" "I want to matter less," she whispered. "I want to not be the reason you lose everything." Something flickered in Patrick's expression. Pain, maybe, or understanding. "You think this is about protecting my position," he said slowly. Betty nodded miserably. "You think I'm defending you because I'm too proud to admit I made a mistake. Didn't you?" Betty's voice was barely audible. Patrick was quiet for so long that Betty thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful, controlled. 3 days ago, I would have said no. I would have told you that claiming you was the right thing to do, that protecting you was my duty as Alpha." He paused, running a hand through his dark hair. "But watching the pack turn against me, seeing the doubt in Jason's eyes, maybe you're right. Maybe this was a mistake." The words hit Betty like a physical blow. She'd asked for honesty, but hearing it hurt more than she'd expected. "So what happens now?" she asked. Patrick looked at her for a long moment, and Betty saw something shift in his expression. The warmth she'd glimpsed over the past few days was gone, replaced by the cold mask of authority he wore with the pack. "Now you stay out of sight," he said flatly. "I'm meeting with the elders this afternoon, and I don't want you anywhere near them. Don't answer the door, don't go outside, don't even look out the windows." "You're locking me up again," Betty said, but there was no fight left in her voice. "I'm keeping you safe," Patrick corrected, but the words sounded hollow even to him. He started toward the door, then stopped and turned back to her. For a moment, Betty thought she saw the real Patrick behind the mask. Tired, conflicted, maybe even regretful. "You don't understand what you've started," he said quietly. "What this claiming has set in motion. There are forces at work here that are bigger than both of us." "Then help me understand," Betty pleaded. But Patrick was already shaking his head. "It's too late for that. The best thing you can do now is stay hidden and hope the pack forgets you exist." He left her standing alone in the vast living room, and Betty knew with crushing certainty that the man who'd claimed her under the full moon was gone. In his place was the Alpha, cold and distant, and already regretting the choice that had brought them together. Outside, the voices of the pack grew louder, hungrier, and Betty realized that her protection had become her prison, and she had no idea if there was any way out. Chapter 7. The Journal Beneath the Floorboards. The silence in Patrick's house had become unbearable. 2 days had passed since the elder meeting, a meeting Betty had heard through the closed study door, voices raised in anger and accusation until Patrick's roar had shaken the windows. When it was over, he'd emerged with blood on his knuckles and something broken in his eyes. He hadn't spoken to her since. Betty found herself cleaning obsessively, needing something to do with her hands while her mind churned. She scrubbed floors that were already spotless, dusted furniture that gleamed, organized books that were perfectly aligned. Anything to feel useful, to feel like less of a burden in this house that had become her prison. It was while moving furniture in the guest room, her room now, she supposed, that she heard the creak. The floorboard near the window shifted under her weight, lifting slightly at one end. Betty knelt and pressed her palm against the wood, feeling it give way with a soft groan of old nails. Curiosity overrode caution. She worked her fingers under the loose board, prying it up with careful pressure. The wood came away to reveal a small cavity beneath, lined with faded cloth. Inside was a leather-bound book, wrapped in what looked like silk scarves that had once been white but had yellowed with age. Betty lifted it carefully, her heart racing with the knowledge that she was touching something that had been hidden for years. The leather cover was soft with wear, unmarked except for a small symbol burned into the lower right corner, a crescent moon cradled in what looked like cupped hands. Betty traced it with her fingertip, feeling the slight depression where the brand had been pressed into the leather. She opened the book with trembling hands. The first page was covered in elegant script that made her breath catch. She recognized the handwriting. It was the same flowing letters that had been on her birth certificate, the same careful strokes she'd seen on old shopping lists tucked away in her mother's few possessions. Sarah Williams, her mother's journal. Betty sank onto the edge of the bed, the book cradled in her lap like something precious and fragile. Her mother had died when Betty was only 5, taken by a fever that swept through the servant quarters one brutal winter. Betty's memories of her were fragments, gentle hands braiding her hair, a voice singing lullabies in the dark, the scent of herbs that always seemed to cling to her clothes. But this book. This was proof that Sarah Williams had been more than just another pack servant. Betty turned the page and began to read. Day 127 of my service to the Silverfang Pack. The Alpha's son is ill again. Another fever that won't break with ordinary remedies. I've prepared a tisane with willow bark and feverfew, but I suspect it will take more than herbs to heal what ails him. The mark on my wrist has been burning for days, responding to his distress. I dare not let anyone see it glow. Betty's breath caught. The mark on her wrist? She rolled up her sleeve, examining her own skin. There was nothing there but a small birthmark she'd always had. A crescent-shaped mark that was barely visible unless you knew to look for it. She kept reading, her heart pounding harder with each page. The boy's fever broke at dawn. When I placed my hands on his forehead, the mark flared so bright I was certain someone would see. But the Alpha was asleep, and the child looked at me with such knowing eyes, as if he could see what I truly am. I fear discovery daily. The moon mark has been dormant for so long I'd hoped it had faded completely. But proximity to the Alpha's bloodline has awakened it. I must be more careful. If the pack discovers what I carry, what I can do. Betty flipped through more pages, finding sketches scattered between entries, detailed drawings of lunar phases, intricate symbols that seemed to shift and move when she wasn't looking directly at them, and most disturbing of all, drawings of wolves with silver light emanating from their chests. The old stories speak of a time when moon-marked wolves lived among all the packs. One entry read, healers blessed by the moon goddess herself, able to channel her light to mend what was broken. But fear consumed the Alphas. They saw the marked not as gifts, but as threats. One by one, the bloodlines were purged. I am the last in this territory, perhaps the last anywhere, but I carry hope beneath my heart now. A daughter who may inherit what I cannot safely use. If the goddess wills it, if the bloodline holds true, perhaps she will be the bridge this fractured world needs. Perhaps she will unite what has been divided. Betty's hands shook as she turned to the next page, finding a detailed sketch of the mark on her wrist. The birthmark she'd always dismissed as meaningless. The moon mark manifests differently in each generation. Mine burns beneath the skin, visible only when the power flows through me. But my daughter. I dream of silver light surrounding her like starshine. I dream of wolves bowing before compassion made manifest. I have hidden this journal where she might find it someday when she's old enough to understand. If something happens to me, and I fear it will, the Alpha grows suspicious of my abilities. She must know what she is, what she could become. Tell her when the time comes that mercy is not weakness, that compassion is the strongest magic of all, and that the moon goddess has not forgotten her children, even in their darkest hour. The next several pages were covered in detailed drawings of symbols and sigils, accompanied by careful notes about their meanings. Protection wards, healing circles, communion rituals that allowed the mark to speak directly with the moon goddess, and at the very end, a passage that made Betty's blood turn to ice. The Alpha knows. I saw it in his eyes today when the mark flared during little Patrick's healing. He spoke to me of the old stories, of the dangers the marked pose to pack stability. He called them abominations, corruptions of natural order. I must leave. Tonight, before he can act on his suspicions. My daughter will be safer without me, raised as a servant, rather than hunted as something unnatural. If she's reading this years from now, if she's found the courage to open what I've hidden, then she already knows the truth. The power is stirring in her, just as it did in me. Be careful, my precious girl. Trust sparingly. And remember, you are not cursed. You are blessed. All my love. Sarah Betty closed the journal with trembling hands, her mind reeling. Her mother hadn't died of fever. She'd fled the pack to protect Betty and probably died alone somewhere in the wilderness. And she'd been moon-marked. a hereditary line of wolves blessed or cursed with the moon goddess's own power. Betty looked down at her wrist, at the crescent-shaped birthmark she'd never thought twice about. As she stared, it seemed to shimmer, just for a moment, like silver catching moonlight. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was why Patrick's wolf had claimed her, not because he wanted her, but because something in his bloodline recognized what she carried, what she might become. The front door slammed downstairs, making Betty jump. She heard Patrick's voice, harsh and angry, talking to someone, Jason probably, based on the lower rumble that answered him. "Can't keep this up much longer," Jason was saying. "The pack is fracturing. Half of them think you've lost your mind, and the other half are starting to wonder if there's truth to the rumors about her." "Let them wonder." Patrick's voice was cold as winter wind. "Patrick, be reasonable. If she really is what they claim, she's not." The finality in Patrick's voice brooked no argument. "How can you be sure?" Silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truths. Betty clutched her mother's journal to her chest, knowing she was eavesdropping on a conversation that could determine her fate. "Because," Patrick said finally, "if she were moon-marked, I would know." The lie rolled off his tongue so smoothly that Betty almost believed it herself. But she could hear the tension underneath, the careful control that suggested he was hiding something. He did know. Somehow, Patrick knew exactly what she was, and he was protecting her secret, even from his closest friend. Betty sank back onto the bed, overwhelmed by the weight of revelation. She wasn't just the rejected Omega who'd been claimed by a powerful Alpha. She was the last of a bloodline that had been systematically destroyed, carrying power that could heal, or, in the eyes of those who feared it, corrupt. No wonder the pack was turning against Patrick. If they suspected what she really was, his protection of her would seem like madness. Or worse, like he'd been bewitched by something dark and unnatural. Betty looked down at her wrist again, and this time the shimmer was unmistakable. Silver light danced beneath her skin like captured moonbeams, responding to her emotional turmoil. She was moon-marked, and according to her mother's journal, that made her either the pack's salvation or its greatest threat. The question was, which would she choose to be? Chapter 8. Bobbie's Shadow. Bobbie crouched in the underbrush at the edge of Patrick's territory, his clothes damp with morning dew and his pride soaked in bitterness. For 3 days now, he'd maintained his vigil, watching the Alpha's house with the dedication of a hunter stalking dangerous prey. Because that's what she was, wasn't she? Dangerous. Unnatural. A corruption wearing the face of an innocent Omega. The other pack members who'd been watching had gradually drifted away, satisfied with their gossiping, content to spread rumors from the safety of their own homes. But Bobbie remained. Bobbie watched. Bobbie waited for proof of what his gut had been screaming since that cursed night under the moon. She'd done something to him, to Patrick, to all of them. He'd felt it the moment the mate bond snapped into place, not the warm recognition he'd expected, but something cold and grasping, like tentacles wrapping around his mind, trying to drag him down into something dark and suffocating. That's why he'd rejected her so violently, so publicly. Not from cruelty, but from instinct. His wolf had recognized a threat and responded accordingly. But Patrick had walked right into the trap. Bobbie shifted his position, trying to ease the cramp in his left leg. He'd been watching for hours, and so far the house had been quiet. Too quiet. What were they doing in there? What unholy communion was taking place behind those pristine walls? Movement in an upstairs window caught his attention. Betty, standing at the glass with something clutched in her hands. Even from this distance, Bobbie could see the tension in her posture, the way she held whatever she was carrying like it was precious. Or dangerous. As he watched, she lifted her wrist and examined it, her head tilted in concentration. For just a moment, Bobbie could have sworn he saw something flicker, a brief flash of silver that made his wolf whine in the back of his mind. Then she moved away from the window, disappearing back into the house's shadowy interior. Bobbie's hands clenched into fists. He'd seen enough. Whatever she was doing, whatever spell she was weaving, it was time someone with sense put a stop to it. He rose from his hiding spot and made his way back toward the Pack village, his mind already working. Who would listen? Who would believe? Jason was too loyal to Patrick to accept the truth readily. But Elder Marcus? Yes, Marcus had influence. And Margaret, the Pack mother who'd been asking uncomfortable questions about the Alpha's behavior. By the time Bobbie reached the village center, he'd composed his story. Not the complete truth. That would make him sound paranoid. But enough to plant seeds of doubt, to water the suspicion that was already growing in fertile ground. He found Margaret first, sweeping her front porch with the methodical precision of someone trying to work through worried thoughts. "Margaret!" Bobbie called out, approaching with the careful deference due to a respected Pack mother. "Might I have a word?" She looked up, her weathered face creasing with concern. "Bobbie, you look troubled, dear. Is everything all right?" "I'm not certain," Bobbie said carefully. "I've been observing the situation with our Alpha and his claimed Omega. What I've seen concerns me." Margaret set aside her broom, giving him her full attention. "What kind of concerns?" Bobbie glanced around theatrically, as if ensuring they wouldn't be overheard. Strange lights in the windows at odd hours, shadows moving in ways that don't match what should be casting them. And the Alpha... He let his voice trail off meaningfully. "What about the Alpha?" Margaret's voice dropped to match his conspiratorial tone. "He's not been himself, has he? Distant, defensive, acting like a man who's not entirely in control of his own thoughts." Bobbie shook his head sadly. "I've known Patrick since we were children, Margaret. What I see now, it's not the man who's led us for 8 years." Margaret's face paled. "You think she's influencing him somehow?" "I think," Bobbie said slowly, "that there are old powers in this world. Dark powers that wise wolves learn to fear for good reason. And I think we may have welcomed one such power into our midst without recognizing it for what it is." He could see the fear taking root in Margaret's eyes, spreading like ink through water. Fear was a powerful tool when wielded correctly, and Bobbie had learned to wield it with surgical precision. "What should we do?" Margaret whispered. "Watch. Listen. Gather evidence." Bobbie placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, and when the time comes, be ready to act for the good of the Pack. He left Margaret standing on her porch, worry etched into every line of her face. By evening, she would have spoken to at least 5 other Pack members. By tomorrow, the whispers would have reached 24 ears. By the end of the week, half the Pack would be looking at their Alpha with suspicion. Bobbie's next stop was the blacksmith shop, where young Carlos was working the bellows with the single-minded focus of someone trying to lose himself in physical labor. "Afternoon, Carlos," Bobbie said, leaning against the doorframe. Carlos looked up, sweat gleaming on his dark skin. "Beta, what brings you to my forge?" "Curiosity, mostly." Bobbie stepped inside, admiring the weapons displayed along the walls. "Fine work, as always. The Pack is fortunate to have someone with your skills." Carlos flushed with pride, but his expression remained guarded. He'd always been one of the more independent-minded Pack members, less inclined to follow blindly, more likely to form his own opinions. "I've been thinking about recent events," Bobbie continued casually. "The Alpha's claiming of the Williams girl. Unusual circumstances, wouldn't you say?" "The Alpha's personal life is his own business," Carlos replied carefully. "Of course, though I can't help but notice how protective he's become. Almost possessive. Strange behavior for someone who barely knew the girl before that night." Carlos's hammer rang against the anvil in steady, rhythmic strikes. Maybe he sees something in her that others don't. "Or maybe he's seeing something that isn't really there," Bobbie suggested quietly. "Tell me, Carlos, in all your years as a Pack member, have you ever seen an Alpha change so dramatically so quickly? Patrick has barely left that house in days. He's isolated himself from his advisors, dismissed concerns from the elders, and seems to think of nothing but protecting one unremarkable Omega. The hammer strokes faltered slightly. What are you suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything, Bobbie said innocently. I'm merely observing that our alpha's behavior has become erratic, and wondering if perhaps there's a reason for that beyond simple infatuation. He let the words hang in the air, watching Carlos process them. The young blacksmith was smart enough to read between the lines, to understand what Bobbie was implying without having to spell it out. The old stories speak of wolves with unusual abilities, Carlos said slowly. Powers that could influence minds, bend wills. Ancient history, Bobbie said dismissively, though I suppose it's possible that such bloodlines might still exist. Hidden, dormant, until the right circumstances awakened them. Carlos set down his hammer, his expression troubled. You really think she's… what? Some kind of witch? I think, Bobbie said carefully, that we owe it to our pack to investigate any threats to our alpha's well-being, don't you? By the time the sun set, Bobbie had spoken to 7 pack members. 7 seeds of doubt, planted in fertile ground and watered with fear. He hadn't made any direct accusations. That would come later, when the whispers had had time to grow into something larger. For now, it was enough to watch those seeds take root. He made his way back to his own small house as darkness fell, feeling more satisfied than he had in days. The Williams girl might have some kind of unnatural hold over Patrick, but she'd made a crucial mistake. She'd isolated herself, cut herself off from potential allies within the pack, and isolation, Bobbie knew, was just another word for vulnerability. Tomorrow, he would begin the next phase. Tomorrow, he would approach Elder Marcus with his concerns, armed with the worried whispers of pack members who were beginning to question their alpha's judgment. And soon, very soon, the pack would demand answers. As he settled into bed, Bobbie allowed himself a small smile of satisfaction. He might have lost his fated mate to the alpha's interference, but he would not lose his pack to whatever dark influence had taken hold of their leader. One way or another, he would see Betty Williams exposed for what she truly was. And when that day came, even Patrick's protection wouldn't be enough to save her. Chapter 9. The Silver Shimmer. Betty couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her mother's careful handwriting, felt the weight of secrets that had been buried for 17 years. The journal lay hidden beneath her mattress now, but its revelations echoed through her mind like whispered prophecies. You are not cursed. You are blessed. She rose from bed and padded to the window, looking out at the forest that surrounded Patrick's house. The moon was nearly full, casting silver light through the trees and making shadows dance like living things. Somewhere out there, she knew the pack slept, unaware that their alpha harbored the very thing their ancestors had feared most. A moon-marked wolf, a daughter of the bloodline they'd spent generations purging. Betty lifted her wrist, studying the crescent-shaped birthmark that had seemed so insignificant her entire life. In the moonlight, it looked different, deeper, as if the silver light was calling to something beneath her skin. As she watched, it began to shimmer. Betty gasped, nearly stumbling backward from the window. The mark on her wrist was glowing, soft at first, then brighter, until silver light pooled beneath her skin like captured starlight. It didn't hurt. If anything, it felt warm, comforting, like coming home after a long journey. She pressed her other hand over the mark, trying to dim its glow, but the light seeped between her fingers like water. When she lifted her hand away, the shimmer had spread, faint silver veins tracing patterns up her arm that matched the symbols in her mother's journal. "Oh, goddess," Betty whispered, sinking onto the edge of her bed. This was really happening. She really was what her mother had claimed to be. Moon-marked, blessed, a living conduit for the goddess's power, and completely, utterly terrified. A soft knock at her door made her heart leap into her throat. The glow vanished instantly, as if her fear had snuffed it out like a candle flame. "Betty?" Patrick's voice was quiet, careful. "Are you awake?" Betty pulled her sleeve down over her wrist, her pulse racing. "Yes, come in." Patrick opened the door slowly, as if he wasn't certain of his welcome. He was dressed in dark jeans and a gray sweater, his hair mussed as if he'd been running his hands through it. In the moonlight streaming through her window, his golden eyes seemed to glow. "I saw your light was on," he said awkwardly. "Thought you might not be able to sleep." Betty almost laughed at the understatement. Something like that. Patrick stepped into the room but remained near the door, maintaining careful distance. The easy warmth of their first few days together was gone, replaced by a tension that made the air between them feel charged. "I wanted to apologize," he said quietly, "for the way I've been treating you, the isolation, the restrictions. You don't deserve that." "Don't I?" Betty met his eyes steadily. "I'm the reason the pack is turning against you. I'm the reason your leadership is being questioned. Maybe isolation is exactly what I deserve." Something flickered in Patrick's expression. "Is that what you think? That you're to blame for this?" "Aren't I?" Betty's voice came out sharper than she'd intended. "If you hadn't claimed me, if you'd just let me walk away after Bobbie's rejection, none of this would be happening." Patrick was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the silver moonlight. "You're right," he said finally. "If I hadn't claimed you, the pack would still be united. My authority would be unquestioned. Everything would be exactly as it was." The words hit Betty like physical blows, even though she'd expected them. "But you know what would also be true?" Patrick continued, stepping closer. "You'd be living in the servant quarters, believing you're worthless because that's what they've told you your entire life. You'd be invisible, unprotected, slowly dying a little more each day because no one sees your worth." Betty's throat tightened. "Maybe that would be better than this." "For who?" Patrick's voice was intense now, all traces of distance gone. "For the pack? For me? Or for you?" Betty couldn't answer. She didn't know anymore. Patrick moved closer still until he was standing directly in front of her. This close, she could smell his scent, earth and rain and something wild that made her wolf stir restlessly. "I need to tell you something," he said quietly, "about why I claimed you, about what my wolf recognized that night." Betty's heart hammered against her ribs. "What do you mean?" Patrick reached for her hand, and Betty didn't pull away. His fingers were warm and calloused, gentle as they traced over her knuckles. "I've been having dreams," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "since I was a child. Dreams of silver light and a woman who could heal with just a touch. My wolf has been searching for something, someone, for years. But I never understood what." He lifted her hand, pushing back the sleeve that covered her wrist. Betty held her breath, waiting for him to see the mark that had been glowing just minutes before. But the birthmark looked ordinary now, just a faint crescent shape against her pale skin. "Until I saw you that night," Patrick continued, his thumb brushing over the mark with devastating gentleness. "The moment Bobbie rejected you, my wolf went wild. It recognized something in you that I'm still trying to understand." Betty stared down at their joined hands, her mind reeling. What kind of something? Patrick was quiet for so long that Betty thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful, as if he were walking through a minefield. "Have you ever noticed anything unusual about yourself? Abilities that other wolves don't seem to have? Moments when you felt connected to something larger than yourself?" The questions were too close to the truth Betty was still processing. She pulled her hand away, wrapping her arms around herself protectively. "Why are you asking me this?" Patrick's golden eyes were intense, searching. "Because the pack's fears aren't entirely unfounded. There are bloodlines in this world that carry power, old power tied to the moon goddess herself. Most were wiped out generations ago, but some might still exist. And you think I'm... Betty couldn't finish the sentence. I think, Patrick said carefully, that you're special in ways you don't even realize yet. And I think my wolf claimed you because it recognized something in your bloodline, something precious, something worth protecting. Betty's chest felt tight as if she couldn't get enough air. What if the pack is right? What if I am dangerous? Then I'll deal with the consequences, Patrick said simply. But I won't abandon you to face this alone. The promise in his voice made something warm unfurl in Betty's chest. For the first time in days, she felt like she could breathe again. There's something I need to show you, she said quietly. She retrieved her mother's journal from its hiding place beneath the mattress, watching Patrick's expression change as she placed it in his hands. My mother wasn't just a servant, Betty said as he opened the leather cover. She was moon-marked, and according to this, so am I. Patrick went very still, his eyes scanning the first page of elegant script. Betty watched his face carefully, looking for signs of fear, disgust, or rejection. Instead, she saw something that looked almost like relief. You knew, Betty realized. Somehow, you already knew. Patrick looked up from the journal, his golden eyes steady. My wolf knew. It's been trying to tell me for days, but I wasn't ready to listen. And now that you know for certain? Patrick set the journal aside and reached for her again, this time with both hands. His palms were warm against her cheeks, his touch gentle but certain. Now I understand why the goddess brought you to me, he said softly, and why I'll fight the entire pack before I let them take you away. As if summoned by his words, the mark on Betty's wrist began to glow again. Silver light seeped through her sleeve, growing brighter with each passing second. This time, she didn't try to hide it. Patrick's eyes widened as the glow intensified, tracing patterns up her arm that were visible even through the fabric of her nightgown. It's beautiful, he whispered, wonder clear in his voice. Betty looked down at herself, seeing the silver light dance beneath her skin like captured moonbeams. For the first time since discovering the journal, she didn't feel afraid. She felt powerful. The pack will never accept this, she said quietly. They'll see it as proof that I'm dangerous. Then they'll learn to live with their fear, Patrick replied, his voice carrying the ring of absolute authority. Because you're not going anywhere. He leaned forward and pressed his forehead against hers, his golden eyes reflecting the silver light that surrounded them both. You are not cursed, he whispered, echoing her mother's words. You are blessed, and anyone who tries to convince you otherwise will answer to me. The light flared brighter, responding to the certainty in his voice. Outside, the moon burned overhead like a beacon, and Betty felt connected to something vast and ancient and infinitely compassionate. She was moon-marked. She was blessed. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid to let her light shine, even if it meant war with the pack that had never wanted her anyway. Chapter 10. The Wounded Warrior. The scream that shattered the morning calm came from the forest's edge, raw and desperate enough to freeze Betty's blood in her veins. She was in Patrick's kitchen, attempting to make breakfast while he handled pack business in his study, when the sound cut through the air like a blade. Through the window, she could see figures running toward the tree line, pack members responding to whatever crisis had erupted in their territory. Betty set down the spatula with trembling hands. Every instinct screamed at her to stay inside, to follow Patrick's constant warnings about remaining hidden. But that scream, it spoke of pain, of someone in desperate need of help. Before she could second-guess herself, Betty was moving. She slipped out the back door and ran toward the commotion, her bare feet silent on the dew-dampened earth. The crowd that had gathered at the forest's edge parted reluctantly as she approached. In the center of the circle, Carlos lay crumpled against the base of an ancient oak tree, his shirt torn and soaked with blood. Deep claw marks raked across his chest, and his breathing came in shallow, pained gasps. "What happened?" Betty asked, dropping to her knees beside him. "Border Patrol," Jason said tersely, appearing at her shoulder. "Rogue wolves from the Northern Territory. Carlos fought them off, but—" He gestured helplessly at the wounds. "Someone needs to get him to the healer," Margaret said, her voice tight with worry. "Elena's in the next territory over," another pack member replied. "Helping with a difficult birth. She won't be back for hours." Betty looked down at Carlos, watching his life seep away with each labored breath. The wounds were deep, potentially fatal without immediate treatment. Without thinking, she pressed her hands against his chest, trying to stem the bleeding. The moment her palms made contact with his skin, everything changed. Silver light exploded from her hands like lightning, washing over Carlos in waves of pure, healing energy. The crowd gasped and stumbled backward, but Betty couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but channel the power that was pouring through her like a river. She felt Carlos's torn flesh knitting together beneath her palms, felt his shattered ribs reforming, felt his punctured lung reinflating. The silver light grew brighter, spreading up her arms and across her chest until she blazed like a fallen star. "Goddess preserve us," someone whispered. "She's moon-marked," another voice said, thick with terror. "She's one of the cursed ones." Betty barely heard them. Her entire being was focused on the healing, on channeling the moon goddess's power through her hands and into Carlos's broken body. She could feel his wolf responding to hers, recognizing the ancient magic that flowed between them. When the light finally faded, Carlos lay before her completely healed. His breathing was deep and steady, his skin unmarked except for faint silver scars that would fade with time. He opened his eyes, dark brown and filled with wonder, and stared up at her like she was something divine. "You saved me," he whispered. Betty pulled her hands away, suddenly aware of the crowd surrounding them. 24 pack members stared at her with expressions ranging from awe to terror, their faces pale in the morning light. "She's a witch," someone hissed from the back of the crowd. "The legends were true," another voice said. "The moon-marked still walk among us." Betty scrambled to her feet, her legs shaking. The power was still coursing through her, making her skin glow with residual silver light. She looked around the circle of faces, seeing fear and suspicion in most of them. "I just wanted to help," she said quietly. "Help?" Bobby's voice cut through the crowd like a whip. He pushed forward, his face twisted with rage and vindication. "You call this help? You've revealed yourself for what you truly are, an abomination, a creature that should have been destroyed generations ago." "She saved Carlos's life," Jason protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "She's bewitched our alpha," Bobbie continued, his voice rising. "Used her unnatural power to cloud his judgment, and now we have proof." The crowd murmured agreement, fear overriding reason. Betty felt their hostility pressing against her like a physical weight, making it hard to breathe. "Where is Patrick?" she asked Jason desperately. Jason's expression was conflicted, torn between loyalty to his alpha and the evidence of his own eyes. "In meetings with the council, they'll need to know about this." "Yes, they will," Bobbie said with savage satisfaction. "They'll need to know that we harbor a moon-marked witch in our territory, and they'll need to decide what to do about it." Betty looked around the circle one more time, seeing nothing but judgment and fear. Even Carlos, whom she'd just saved from death, looked uncertain as he met her eyes. "I need to go," she whispered. She turned and ran, hearing their voices rise behind her in angry discussion. By the time she reached Patrick's house, her chest was tight with panic and her hands were still glowing with residual power. She'd saved a life, and in doing so, she'd probably signed her own death warrant. Chapter 11. The Wolf's Reaction. Betty burst through the front door of Patrick's house, her heart hammering against her ribs and silver light still dancing beneath her skin. She could hear voices from his study, the deep rumble of Elder Marcus, the sharp tones of other council members. The meeting was still in session. She hesitated at the bottom of the stairs, torn between the need to hide and the desperate urge to tell Patrick what had happened before someone else did. The decision was made for her when the study door opened and Elder Marcus emerged, his weathered face creased with concern. "We'll reconvene this afternoon," he was saying over his shoulder. "After we've all had time to consider." His words died as he caught sight of Betty standing in the foyer, her nightgown torn from her run through the forest, and her skin still faintly luminescent. His eyes widened, taking in the silver traces that marked her as something other than human. "Blessed goddess," Marcus breathed. "The rumors are true." Patrick appeared in the doorway behind him, and the moment his golden eyes locked onto Betty, everything changed. His pupils dilated until they were black pools surrounded by rings of molten gold. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, and a low growl rumbled from his chest. Not quite human, not quite wolf, but something primal and dangerous. "Everyone out," Patrick said, his voice rough and strained. "Now." "Patrick," Elder Marcus began. "Out!" The word exploded from Patrick with such force that the windows rattled. The other council members fled past Betty without meeting her eyes, their faces pale with shock and fear. Elder Marcus lingered for a moment, his gaze moving between Patrick and Betty with growing understanding. "So it's true," he said quietly. "She's moon-marked. And you've bonded with her." Patrick's growl deepened and Betty could see his control beginning to fracture. The civilized veneer he wore as Alpha was cracking, revealing something wild and elemental underneath. "Get out before I forget you're an old friend," Patrick warned, and there was enough menace in his voice to make Marcus pale. The elder left without another word, the front door closing behind him with a soft click. Betty and Patrick stood alone in the suddenly silent house, the air between them crackling with tension. "You used your power," Patrick said, and his voice was barely recognizable. "In front of the pack." "Carlos was dying," Betty said defensively. "I couldn't just watch. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Patrick took a step toward her, his movement predatory and fluid. "What you've started?" Betty lifted her chin, refusing to back down. "I saved a life. I won't apologize for that." Patrick laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Apologize? Betty, you've just confirmed every fear the pack has harbored about you. You've given them proof that you're exactly what they suspected. And what's that? Dangerous." Patrick's eyes blazed with an inner fire that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with something much more primal. "Powerful. Mine." The last word came out as more growl than speech, and Betty felt her own wolf respond with a shiver of recognition. There was something happening here that went beyond their previous conversations, beyond the careful dance they'd been performing around each other. "Patrick?" Betty said uncertainly. He closed the distance between them in 2 quick strides, his hands coming up to frame her face. His palms were warm against her cheeks, but Betty could feel the tremor in his fingers, the barely restrained control of a man fighting his own nature. "My wolf is going insane," he said roughly. "It's been clawing at the inside of my skull since the moment I saw you glowing like starlight. It wants to claim you properly. It wants to make you mine in every way that matters." Betty's breath caught. "What does that mean?" "It means," Patrick said, his voice dropping to a whisper, "that seeing you use your power, seeing you blazing with the moon goddess's light, has awakened something in me that I've been trying to ignore. Something that recognizes you as more than just an omega under my protection." His thumbs brushed over her cheekbones, and Betty could see the gold in his eyes flickering like flame. "The mate bond," she breathed. "Stronger than anything I've ever felt," Patrick confirmed. "Even stronger than what you had with Bobbie. This isn't just attraction or affection, Betty. This is destiny. This is the moon goddess herself saying that we belong together." The confession should have been romantic, but there was something almost desperate in Patrick's voice, something that spoke of a man at war with himself. "But you're afraid," Betty said, reading the conflict in his expression. Patrick's hands tightened on her face. "Terrified," he admitted, "because the legends that speak of moon-marked wolves also speak of the alphas who loved them. And those stories, they don't end well." Before Betty could ask what he meant, a commotion erupted outside. Voices raised in anger, footsteps on the front porch, the sound of someone pounding on the door. "Patrick!" Jason's voice carried through the wood. "Open up. The pack is demanding answers." Patrick's expression hardened, the vulnerable man disappearing behind the mask of alpha authority. But his hands remained on Betty's face, and she could see the war raging in his golden eyes. "They'll want to examine you," he said quietly, "to determine if you're a threat." "And if they decide I am?" Patrick's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "Then they'll learn why challenging an alpha's mate is a mistake they'll only make once." The pounding on the door grew more insistent, but Patrick ignored it completely. His entire focus was on Betty, on the silver light that still danced beneath her skin. "I need you to understand something," he said urgently. "What happens next, whatever the pack demands or threatens, I won't let them take you. I can't. My wolf would tear them apart before allowing it." The possessive intensity in his voice should have frightened Betty. Instead, it made something warm unfurl in her chest, the recognition that she was valued, protected, claimed by someone who would fight the world to keep her safe. "What if fighting for me destroys you?" she asked softly. Patrick's expression softened, and for a moment she saw the man beneath the alpha, vulnerable, conflicted, and completely devoted to her. "Then I'll burn for you," he said simply, "and count it a privilege." The words hung between them like a promise and a threat, beautiful and terrible in their certainty. Outside, the voices grew louder, more demanding, but Betty found she didn't care. Let them come. Let them try to tear her away from the man who'd claimed her, protected her, and was now willing to sacrifice everything for her. She was moon-marked, she was blessed, and she was falling in love with an alpha who might just be willing to die for her. The question was, would she let him? Chapter 12. The Alpha's Confession. The pounding on the door had stopped, but Patrick knew it was only temporary. Through the windows, he could see pack members gathering in his front yard. Not the casual observers from previous days, but an organized group with purpose written in their tense postures. They'd seen Betty's power, they knew what she was, and they wanted answers. "They're not going to give up," Betty said quietly, moving to stand beside him at the window. Her skin had stopped glowing, but Patrick could still feel the power radiating from her like heat from a forge. "No," he agreed. "They're not." Betty wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly looking very young and very fragile. "Maybe I should just face them, answer their questions, show them I'm not a threat." Patrick turned from the window, his expression fierce. "Absolutely not." "But if I explain—" "They won't listen to explanations," Patrick cut her off. "They're afraid, Betty, and afraid people don't think clearly. They react." He moved away from the window, beginning to pace the length of the living room like a caged wolf. Betty watched him, noting the restless energy that seemed to pour off him in waves. "There's something you're not telling me," she said. "About the moon-marked, about what the legends really say." Patrick stopped pacing, his shoulders tensing. "The legends are complicated. Try me." Patrick was quiet for so long that Betty thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "The moon-marked weren't just healers," he said. "They were bridges, conduits between the mortal world and the divine. When they mated with alphas, the bond created something unprecedented. Wolves who could channel not just healing power, but the full authority of the moon goddess herself." Betty felt a chill run down her spine. What kind of authority? "The power to command any wolf, regardless of rank. The ability to settle disputes with nothing more than a touch." healing that could bring back the recently dead. Patrick's golden eyes met hers. They were essentially divine instruments, and their alpha mates were their anchors to the mortal world. That sounds... Betty searched for the right word. Overwhelming. It was, for both partners. The legends speak of incredible harmony, yes, but also of madness. Alphas driven insane by the constant flow of divine power through their bond. Moon-marked wolves who lost themselves in the goddess's light and forgot how to be mortal. Patrick sat down heavily in one of the leather chairs, suddenly looking exhausted. And then there were the children, he continued quietly. Children? The offspring of such unions were unique, more powerful than their parents, but also more unstable. Some became great leaders, uniting entire regions under their compassionate rule. Others became tyrants, drunk on divine power and convinced of their own infallibility. Betty sank onto the couch across from him, the weight of implication settling over her like a shroud. That's why they were purged. Not because they were evil, but because they were unpredictable. The pack leaders of that era decided it was too dangerous to allow the bloodlines to continue, Patrick confirmed. Better to eliminate the risk entirely than hope the next generation would use their power wisely. And now? Betty's voice was barely a whisper. What happens when they realize what I am? What we could become together? Patrick leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his expression intense. That depends on whether they believe the old stories, whether they think we're a blessing or a curse. As if summoned by his words, Jason's voice carried through the front door. Patrick, the elders are demanding a formal assembly. The entire pack wants to hear your explanation for harboring a moon-marked wolf. Patrick stood, his expression hardening into the mask of authority Betty had seen him wear with the pack. And if I refuse, then they'll call for a challenge to your leadership, Jason replied through the door. Bobbie's already making noise about a vote of no confidence. Betty felt her stomach drop. They can do that? In extreme circumstances, Patrick said grimly. If enough pack members believe their alpha has been compromised, they can demand a formal review of his fitness to lead. Because of me. Betty's voice was hollow. Because you protected me. Patrick moved to sit beside her on the couch, his hands finding hers. Betty, look at me. She met his golden eyes reluctantly. What I'm about to tell you, I need you to hear completely. No interruptions, no arguments. Just listen. Betty nodded, though her throat felt tight with unshed tears. The night you were rejected by Bobbie, the moment I saw you standing there broken and humiliated, my wolf recognized you. Not just as someone in need of protection, but as something it had been searching for its entire life. Patrick's thumbs traced over her knuckles, his touch gentle despite the intensity of his words. I've been having dreams about you since I was a teenager, Betty. Dreams of silver light and healing hands and a woman who could touch my soul with just a look. I thought they were fantasies, wishful thinking from a lonely alpha who was tired of political matches and empty relationships. Betty's heart hammered against her ribs. But they weren't fantasies. They were prophecy. My wolf was showing me my true mate years before I was ready to understand what I was seeing. Patrick's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. When I claimed you that night, it wasn't noble impulse or political calculation. It was recognition. It was coming home. Tears spilled down Betty's cheeks, and she made no effort to stop them. Why didn't you tell me? Because I was terrified, Patrick admitted. The bond between an alpha and a moon-marked omega. It's not something that can be undone, Betty. Once it's completed, once we're fully mated, there's no going back. We become something new together, something that's never quite human again. And if I'm not ready for that? Patrick's hands tightened on hers. Then I'll wait, for as long as it takes, even if it destroys me. The raw honesty in his voice made Betty's chest ache. She could see the truth written in every line of his face. He would wait for her, protect her, fight for her, even if it cost him everything. "You said the legends don't end well," she said quietly. Patrick's expression grew pained. "Most don't. The power is intoxicating, Betty. It's easy to lose yourself in it, to forget that you're supposed to serve others rather than rule them. And the bond, it's so intense that it can consume everything else. Some couples became so obsessed with each other that they neglected their duties, their pack, their humanity." "Is that what you're afraid of? That we'll lose ourselves?" "I'm afraid," Patrick said carefully, "that I already have. 3 days ago, I was willing to risk civil war to protect you. Yesterday, I nearly shifted in front of the elders because someone questioned your right to be here. And today..." He shook his head. "Today, I'm ready to fight the entire pack if they try to take you away from me." The confession hung between them, heavy with implication. Betty could see the conflict in Patrick's eyes, the war between his duty as alpha and his devotion to her. "You think protecting me makes you weak," she said. "I think protecting you makes me dangerous," Patrick corrected. "To myself, to the pack, to anyone who threatens what we have." Betty was quiet for a long moment, processing everything he'd told her. Outside, she could hear the pack's voices growing louder, more insistent. Time was running out. "What if we don't have to choose?" she asked finally. Patrick looked at her questioningly. "What if the legends got it wrong? What if the moon marked and their alphas failed not because they were too powerful, but because they tried to carry that power alone?" Betty met his eyes steadily. "What if the answer isn't isolation, but integration? Not ruling over the pack, but serving alongside them?" Something flickered in Patrick's expression. Hope, maybe, or the beginning of understanding. "You want to face them," he said. "Together." "I want to stop running," Betty said firmly. "I want to stop hiding, and I want to find out if we're strong enough to be what we're meant to be without losing who we are." Patrick studied her face for a long moment, and Betty could see him weighing the risks, calculating the odds. "If we do this," he said finally, "there's no going back. The pack will either accept us or tear us apart. There won't be a middle ground." "Then we'd better make sure they accept us," Betty said with more confidence than she felt. Patrick's lips curved in a smile that was equal parts admiration and terror. "You are either my salvation or my undoing, Betty Williams. And I honestly don't know which scares me more." Betty leaned forward and pressed her forehead against his, feeling the electric connection that sparked between them whenever they touched. "Then let's find out together," she whispered. Outside, the pack waited for answers, and for the first time since this all began, Betty was ready to give them the truth. All of it. Chapter 13. The Scrolls of Truth. Jason had always been meticulous about pack records. As Patrick's lieutenant, he'd spent countless hours in the archive room beneath the meeting hall, organizing centuries of documents, treaties, and bloodline records. But tonight, he searched with desperate purpose, looking for something that might explain the impossible. Betty Williams was moon-marked. That much was undeniable after what he'd witnessed at the forest's edge. But the implications of her heritage, the danger it represented, the power it promised, those answers lay buried in texts so old their pages cracked at the touch. He'd been searching for 3 hours when he found it. Tucked between land dispute records and hunting agreements was a leather portfolio bound with silver wire. The cover bore the same crescent moon symbol he'd seen glowing on Betty's wrist, and when Jason opened it with trembling hands, he understood why it had been hidden. The first document was a genealogy chart, mapping bloodlines back 7 generations. At the top, written in faded ink that had once been gold, was a name that made Jason's breath catch. Sarah Williams, daughter of Elena Williams, daughter of Maria Santos. The line stretched back through history, each name marked with the same lunar symbol. The moon line hadn't died out. It had simply gone into hiding. The second document was worse. Written in the formal language of ancient prophecy, it detailed the return of the marked ones and their role in the world's renewal. Jason's hands shook as he read. When the silver light returns to mortal flesh, when the moon's daughter walks among the children of earth, the time of choosing shall come. The marked one shall heal what has been broken, unite what has been divided, and bring peace to the warring souls of both human and wolf. But beware the price of such grace, for the one who loves her shall know both salvation and damnation. Through her, he shall touch the divine, but in touching the divine, he shall risk losing himself entirely. The Alpha who claims the moon's daughter shall become her anchor in the mortal world, as she becomes his gateway to the eternal. Together, they shall either lift their people to greatness or cast them into shadow. There shall be no middle path. Jason's chest tightened as he read the final paragraph. By her light, the pack shall be reborn. By her darkness, it shall be consumed. The choice lies not with fate, but with the heart that loves her. A soft footstep behind him made Jason spin around, his hand instinctively reaching for the weapon at his belt. But it was only Bobbie, standing in the doorway with an expression of keen interest. "Working late?" Bobbie asked, stepping into the archive room without invitation. Jason instinctively moved to shield the documents. "Pack business. Nothing that concerns you." "Doesn't it?" Bobbie's eyes fixed on the portfolio in Jason's hands. "That symbol on the cover, I've seen it before. On her wrist, when the silver light flared." Jason's jaw tightened. "You shouldn't be here, Bobbie." Neither should she. Bobbie stepped closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "But here we are, and here she is, and our Alpha is too blinded by whatever spell she's cast to see the danger." "It's not a spell," Jason said automatically, then immediately regretted revealing so much. Bobbie's eyes sharpened. "No? Then what is it? What did you find in those dusty old books that explains why our Alpha has lost his mind over a servant girl?" Jason remained silent, but Bobbie was nothing if not persistent. He moved closer, close enough that Jason could smell the desperation rolling off him in waves. "You know what she is," Bobbie continued. "You've seen the records, haven't you? The bloodlines, the prophecies, all those ancient warnings our ancestors left behind." Despite himself, Jason found his gaze flickering to the documents in his hands. It was a mistake. Bobbie's expression shifted from curiosity to triumph in an instant. "She's one of them. One of the cursed bloodlines that should have died out generations ago." Bobbie's voice was gaining momentum now, fed by the certainty of his suspicions. "And Patrick. Goddess help us. Patrick is bound to her, isn't he? Not by choice, but by whatever dark magic flows in her veins." "You don't understand," Jason began. "I understand perfectly." Bobbie's eyes blazed with vindication. "Our Alpha has been compromised by forces beyond his control. He's not choosing to protect her, he's compelled to, enslaved by bloodline magic that our ancestors feared enough to wipe out." Jason clutched the portfolio tighter. The prophecies speak of healing, not enslavement, of unity, not destruction. "Prophecies written by the moon-marked themselves," Bobbie scoffed. "Do you really think they'd document their own capacity for evil? Of course they painted themselves as saviors. That's what makes them so dangerous." The lieutenant found himself wavering. The documents spoke of light and healing, yes, but they also warned of the price such power demanded. And Patrick had been different since claiming Betty. More protective, more isolated, more willing to risk everything for a woman he'd known less than a week. "What are you suggesting?" Jason asked quietly. Bobbie smiled, and there was nothing pleasant about the expression. "I'm suggesting that our pack is in danger from an enemy that's already inside our walls. And I'm suggesting that we have a duty to protect our people, even if that means protecting them from their Alpha's compromised judgment. You're talking about rebellion. I'm talking about salvation." Bobbie's voice was fervent now, filled with the certainty of a man who believed himself righteous. The elders already have doubts. After what happened today, after seeing her power with their own eyes, they're ready to listen to reason. Jason looked down at the documents in his hands, at the prophecies that spoke of both light and shadow, salvation and damnation. The choice lies not with fate, but with the heart that loves her. But what if that heart had been corrupted? What if Patrick's love wasn't real, but a magical compulsion designed to give the moon-marked wolf protection and power? The pack deserves to know the truth, Bobbie continued softly. All of it. The bloodlines, the prophecies, the real reason their alpha is willing to risk civil war for a servant girl. And if you're wrong, Jason asked, if she really is meant to heal rather than harm? Bobbie's expression hardened. Then we'll know soon enough. But if I'm right, if she's the beginning of something dark and terrible, then waiting could cost us everything. Jason stared at the portfolio for a long moment, feeling the weight of decision pressing down on him. He could hide these documents, keep the truth buried, and hope that Patrick's judgment was sound. Or he could trust his duty to the pack over his loyalty to his friend. The elders meet tomorrow night, Bobbie said quietly. They'll want to see whatever you found. Jason closed his eyes, knowing that he was about to cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed. I'll bring the documents. Bobbie's smile was sharp as a blade. You're doing the right thing, Jason. For the pack. For all of us. But as Jason watched the Beta leave, his hands still trembling around the ancient prophecies, he wondered if he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life. Outside, the moon hung heavy in the sky, watching the machinations of mortals with ancient, unblinking eyes. And in her house at the edge of the territory, Betty Williams slept fitfully, unaware that her fate was being decided by men who feared what they didn't understand. The prophecy had been found. The truth had been revealed. Now all that remained was to see whether that truth would save them or destroy them all. Chapter 14. Love or Destiny. Betty woke to the sound of Patrick pacing in the hallway outside her room. His footsteps were restless, agitated, punctuated by occasional pauses that suggested he was stopping to lean against the wall or run his hands through his hair. She'd been having the dream again, the one where silver light poured from her hands while wolves bowed at her feet. But this time, the dream had been different. This time, Patrick had been there, his golden eyes reflecting her glow, his expression torn between awe and terror. When she opened her door, she found him exactly as she'd imagined, disheveled, conflicted, wearing the same clothes from the day before as if he hadn't slept at all. Patrick, she said softly, what's wrong? He looked up at her, and Betty's heart clenched at the exhaustion in his eyes. We need to talk. Something in his tone made her stomach drop. About what? About us. About what we are to each other. Patrick gestured toward the stairs. Come on, there are things you need to know. They settled in his study, a room Betty had never entered before. It was smaller than the living areas, more intimate, lined with books and personal photographs that spoke of a life lived in service to others. Patrick sat behind his desk, but the formal barrier seemed to emphasize the distance between them, rather than bridge it. Jason found some documents last night, Patrick began without preamble. Ancient records about the moon-marked bloodlines, about the prophecies surrounding their return. Betty's chest tightened. What kind of prophecies? Patrick pulled out a folder, the same leather portfolio Jason had discovered in the archives. When he opened it, Betty saw her mother's name at the top of a genealogy chart that stretched back through centuries. Your bloodline is older than we thought, Patrick said quietly. The moon-marked weren't just isolated individuals. They were part of a continuous line stretching back to the very first wolves blessed by the moon goddess. Betty leaned forward, studying the names that connected her to a heritage she'd never known existed. What does that mean? It means you're not just powerful, Betty. You're the culmination of generations of selective breeding, of bloodlines carefully preserved for a specific purpose. Patrick's voice was carefully neutral, but Betty could hear the tension underneath. According to these prophecies, you're meant to heal the fractured relationship between wolves and the divine. That sounds... Betty searched for the right word. Important. It is, but there's more. Patrick turned the page, revealing the prophecy Jason had found. The marked one shall heal what has been broken, unite what has been divided. But the price of such grace is steep. As Betty read the ancient words, her heart sank with each line. The prophecy spoke of salvation and damnation, of love that could either lift or destroy. And at the center of it all was the warning that chilled her to the bone. The Alpha who claims the moon's daughter shall become her anchor in the mortal world, as she becomes his gateway to the eternal. This isn't love, Betty whispered, the words tasting bitter on her tongue. This is assignment, destiny, fate deciding who we're supposed to be with. Patrick's expression was carefully controlled, but Betty could see the conflict in his golden eyes. The prophecy suggests that our bond serves a larger purpose, yes. Suggests? Betty's voice was rising despite her efforts to stay calm. Patrick, this says you were literally destined to claim me, that your feelings aren't real, they're just cosmic programming. That's not... Isn't it? Betty stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. How long have you known about this? Patrick's silence was answer enough. How long? Betty demanded. I suspected from the beginning, Patrick admitted quietly. The dreams I told you about, the way my wolf recognized you, it all pointed to something deeper than coincidence. Betty felt like the floor was falling away beneath her feet. So when you claimed me, when you protected me, when you said all those things about seeing my worth, none of it was real. It was real, Patrick said fiercely, rising from his chair. My feelings for you are real, Betty. The bond between us is real. But is it yours? Betty's voice cracked with the question. Or does it belong to the prophecy, to whatever cosmic plan decided we should be together? Patrick moved around the desk, reaching for her, but Betty stepped back. The hurt that flashed across his face was almost enough to break her resolve. Does it matter? He asked quietly. Of course it matters. Betty's voice broke completely now, tears spilling down her cheeks. I've spent my entire life being told I'm worthless, undeserving of love. And when I finally find someone who seems to see value in me, it turns out to be because ancient magic decided we should be together. Betty, please. No. She backed toward the door, shaking her head. I can't do this. I can't be someone's destiny. I can't be the answer to prophecies written by people who died centuries ago. You're more than that, Patrick said desperately. You're Betty, the woman who heals without thinking of the cost, who sees good in people others have written off, who saved Carlos's life yesterday without hesitation. Am I? Betty's laugh was hollow. Or am I just playing out a script that was written before I was born? How can I tell the difference between who I really am and who the prophecy says I should be? The question hung between them like a chasm. Patrick stared at her, his golden eyes bright with unshed tears, and Betty could see that he didn't have an answer. Because maybe there wasn't one. I need time, Betty said quietly. I need to figure out who I am when I'm not being someone's fated mate or prophesied savior. And us? Patrick's voice was barely audible. Betty looked at him, this strong, complicated man who'd turned his world upside down for her, and felt her heart break a little more. I don't know if there is an us, she whispered, or if there's just a prophecy wearing our faces. She left him standing in his study, surrounded by the weight of ancient words and cosmic expectations. As she climbed the stairs to her room, Betty could feel the silver mark on her wrist burning like a brand, reminding her that she would never be just herself. She was the moon's daughter, the healing light, the bridge between mortal and divine, and she had never felt more alone in her life. Chapter 15. The Rebellion Brews. The emergency pack meeting was called for sunset, but Bobbie arrived early to ensure everything was arranged to his advantage. He positioned himself near the front of the gathering space, where his voice would carry clearly, and made sure his allies were scattered throughout the crowd to provide vocal support when needed. Elder Marcus entered first, his weathered face grave with the weight of what they were about to discuss. Behind him came the other elders, 5 in total, representing decades of pack wisdom and tradition. Bobbie had spoken to each of them privately over the past day, planting seeds of doubt that had grown into genuine concern. The regular pack members filed in gradually, their conversations hushed but urgent. Word had spread about Betty's display of power, about the ancient documents Jason had uncovered, about the prophecies that painted their situation in mythic, terrifying terms. Patrick entered last, alone. Betty was notably absent, and Bobbie felt a surge of satisfaction. If the Alpha was too ashamed to bring his supposed mate to face the pack's judgment, it only strengthened Bobbie's position. "We are gathered," Elder Marcus began formally, "to address concerns about recent events within our territory. Specifically, the claiming of an Omega who has displayed unusual abilities." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Bobbie let them build for a moment before rising to his feet. "Unusual is putting it mildly," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the gathering space. "What we witnessed yesterday was the manifestation of power that our ancestors feared enough to eliminate from all pack territories. The moon-marked bloodlines were destroyed for good reason," Margaret called out from the crowd, her voice shaking with conviction. "They brought nothing but chaos and corruption." "That's not entirely accurate," Jason said reluctantly. He stood near the back, holding the portfolio of ancient documents. "The records speak of both light and shadow. The moon-marked could heal, yes, but they could also... Could also what?" Elder Marcus prompted. Jason's jaw tightened. "Could also compel obedience, bind the wills of others to their own through supernatural means." The crowd erupted in angry whispers. Bobbie felt triumph surge through him. Jason's reluctant testimony was worth more than a dozen passionate speeches. "And our Alpha?" Bobbie asked pointedly. "Has he shown any signs of altered behavior since claiming this Omega?" The question sparked heated discussion throughout the gathering. Pack members who'd noticed Patrick's increased isolation, his protective fury, his willingness to risk everything for a woman he barely knew, began voicing their concerns. "He's not been himself," Carlos said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd been saved by Betty's power. "More possessive, more willing to fight." "He threatened the elders," another voice called out. "His own advisors, questioning their loyalty for simply asking questions." Bobbie nodded gravely. "These are not the actions of an Alpha in control of his own mind. These are the actions of a man under supernatural influence." Elder Marcus held up his hand for silence. "You're suggesting that our Alpha has been... what? Bewitched?" "I'm suggesting that our Alpha has been bound by magic he doesn't understand to a woman whose very bloodline represents a threat to pack stability," Bobbie replied. "The prophecies speak of Alphas who loved moon-marked wolves, Elder Marcus. Do you know how those stories ended?" The elder's face was grave. "Poorly, from what I've read." "Madness," Bobbie said, his voice carrying the ring of certainty. "Obsession so complete that the Alphas forgot their duties to their packs. Some became tyrants, drunk on their mates' power. Others became hermits, caring only for their moon-marked partners while their territories fell into chaos." The crowd stirred uneasily. These were fears that resonated deep in pack consciousness, the terror of a leader who put personal desires above collective welfare. "But perhaps most dangerous," Bobbie continued, his voice dropping to ensure everyone leaned forward to listen, "were those who became mere vessels. Alphas so completely bound to their mate's will that they lost all independent thought, becoming nothing more than instruments of moon-marked ambition." "That's enough," a new voice cut through the gathering. Patrick stood in the doorway, his golden eyes blazing with fury. "I won't listen to you poison the pack against someone who's done nothing but try to help." Bobbie turned to face him, making sure his expression showed sorrow rather than triumph. Patrick, my friend, I know this is difficult to hear, but we're trying to help you see clearly. See clearly? Patrick's laugh was bitter. I see a pack turning against an innocent woman because they're afraid of what they don't understand. Innocent? Elder Marcus's voice was sharp. She concealed her nature from us, used her power without permission or oversight. How do we know what other abilities she's hiding? She saved Carlos's life, Patrick said firmly. That hardly seems like the action of someone with malicious intent. Or it could have been a demonstration, Bobbie suggested quietly. A display of power designed to make us grateful, to lower our guard before the real manipulation begins. Patrick's hands clenched into fists. You're twisting everything to fit your narrative. Am I? Bobbie gestured to Jason, who reluctantly stepped forward with the ancient documents. Tell them what the prophecies say about moon-marked influence, Jason. Tell them about the warnings our ancestors left. Jason's face was pale, but he opened the portfolio with trembling hands. The texts speak of compulsion, the ability to bind others' wills through emotional manipulation and supernatural influence. And the alphas who loved them? Bobbie pressed. Lost themselves, Jason admitted quietly. The bond became so all-consuming that they ceased to function as independent entities. Patrick's expression grew dangerous. Are you suggesting I'm not in control of my own mind? I'm suggesting, Bobbie said carefully, that love and compulsion can be difficult to distinguish when supernatural forces are involved. How can you be certain your feelings are your own? The question hit its mark. Patrick's face went pale, and for a moment, uncertainty flickered in his eyes. Bobbie pressed his advantage. We've all seen the changes in you, Patrick. The isolation, the possessiveness, the willingness to threaten anyone who questions your judgment. These aren't the behaviors of the alpha we've known for 8 years. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Pack members nodded, sharing glances that spoke of growing consensus. Where is she? Margaret called out suddenly. If the Omega has nothing to hide, why isn't she here to face our questions? Because I won't subject her to this witch hunt, Patrick snarled. Witch hunt? Bobbie's voice was perfectly modulated to convey hurt rather than anger. Patrick, we're trying to protect our pack. If she's truly innocent, if her power comes from benevolent sources, then surely examination by our elders would prove that. And if she refuses? Elder Marcus asked pointedly. Bobbie let the question hang in the air, knowing the implication would be clear to everyone present. Innocent people didn't refuse to prove their innocence. The pack has a right to safety, he said finally. If the Omega won't submit to examination, if our Alpha won't allow us to verify that our leadership hasn't been compromised, then we have a duty to act. What kind of action? Carlos asked, his voice tight with tension. Bobbie looked around the gathering, seeing the fear and uncertainty in too many faces. The seeds he'd planted had grown into something larger, a genuine movement driven by terror of the unknown. The ancient laws provide for situations where an alpha's judgment has been compromised, he said carefully. A formal challenge to leadership can be called if enough pack members believe their safety is at stake. The crowd erupted in shocked whispers. Challenging an alpha was serious business, potentially deadly for the challenger, catastrophic for pack unity if it failed. You're talking about civil war, Patrick said quietly, but his voice carried clearly across the suddenly silent gathering. I'm talking about salvation, Bobbie replied, his tone earnest and convinced. The pack is fracturing, Patrick. Half of us live in fear while the other half watches their alpha become someone they don't recognize. This can't continue. Elder Marcus stepped forward, his weathered face grave. The Beta raises valid concerns. Perhaps a formal review of the situation is warranted. A review by whom? Patrick demanded. By the Council of Territories, Marcus replied. Neutral alphas who can assess the situation without bias. Patrick's expression turned thunderous. You want to invite outsiders into our territory to judge my fitness to lead? We want to ensure our pack's survival, Bobbie said with perfect sincerity. If you're truly uncompromised, if the Omega truly poses no threat, then you have nothing to fear from objective examination. The logic was impossible to argue against without seeming defensive or guilty. Patrick stood silent for a long moment, his golden eyes sweeping across the faces of pack members who'd followed him loyally for years. And if I refuse? He asked quietly. Then the pack will have its answer, Bobbie said sadly, and we'll be forced to take steps to protect ourselves. The threat was veiled but unmistakable. Patrick could submit to outside judgment or face rebellion from within. Either way, Bobbie had maneuvered him into an impossible position. I need time to consider, Patrick said finally. Of course, Elder Marcus replied. But not too much time. The pack's patience is not infinite. As the gathering dispersed, Bobbie felt satisfaction flow through him like wine. The seeds of doubt had become saplings of rebellion, and those saplings were growing into trees of revolution. Patrick might be bound to his moon-marked mate, but the pack belonged to whoever could keep them safe, and Bobbie intended to prove that person was him. The prophecy spoke of healing and unity, but Bobbie knew the truth. The moon-marked brought only chaos and corruption, and he would save his pack from both, no matter the cost. Chapter 16. The challenge declared. The Council of Territories arrived at dawn, 3 days after the pack meeting that had shattered whatever illusion of unity remained. Betty watched from her bedroom window as the foreign alphas made their way up the forest path. Powerful wolves from neighboring territories, their very presence a public declaration that Patrick's leadership was in question. She hadn't spoken to Patrick since their confrontation in his study. He'd tried several times to reach her, standing outside her door in the early hours before dawn, his voice carefully controlled as he asked her to talk to him. But Betty couldn't bring herself to face him, not when she wasn't sure if anything between them was real. Now, watching the procession of wolves who'd come to judge their situation, she felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like lead. This was her fault. Her presence, her power, her very existence had brought chaos to a pack that had been stable for years. Betty? A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. May I come in? It was Jason's voice, not Patrick's. Betty opened the door to find the lieutenant looking haggard, dark circles under his eyes suggesting he'd slept as little as she had. The council wants to speak with you, he said without preamble, before they make their formal assessment. Betty's stomach clenched. What kind of assessment? They're here to determine whether Patrick's judgment has been compromised by supernatural influence, Jason said carefully, and whether you represent a threat to pack stability. The clinical language didn't disguise the reality. They were here to decide if she was a witch who'd bewitched their alpha, and what should be done about it. And if they decide I am a threat? Jason's expression was pained. Then they'll recommend action to neutralize that threat. Exile, if she was lucky. Death, if she wasn't. Betty nodded, surprised by how calm she felt. Maybe it was relief. The burden of uncertainty finally lifted, replaced by the clarity of impending judgment. I'll come down, she said quietly. The council had assembled in Patrick's living room, 3 alphas whose combined presence made the spacious room feel cramped and dangerous. Betty recognized their type immediately, old guard leaders who valued tradition and stability above all else. They looked at her like she was a fascinating but potentially venomous creature. Patrick stood near the fireplace, his posture rigid with barely controlled tension. When Betty entered the room, his golden eyes found hers immediately, and she saw a flash of relief mixed with pain. Miss Williams, the eldest alpha said, rising from his chair. I am Alpha Nathaniel of the Eastern Territories. These are my colleagues, Alpha Marcus of the Northern Reach and Alpha Elena of the Coastal Packs. Betty inclined her head respectfully, noting how none of them offered to shake her hand. They'd maintain careful distance until they decided whether she was dangerous. "We understand you've recently manifested certain abilities," Alpha Elena said, her voice carefully neutral. "Would you mind demonstrating them for us?" "I don't perform on command," Betty replied quietly but firmly. Alpha Marcus raised an eyebrow. That's an interesting response from someone accused of using supernatural manipulation. "I heal," Betty said, meeting his gaze steadily. "I don't manipulate. The power comes when someone needs help, not when observers want entertainment." "Convenient," Alpha Nathaniel observed. "How are we to assess abilities you claim you can't control?" Before Betty could respond, the front door burst open. Bobbie strode in, flanked by several pack members including Margaret and two of the younger elders. His face was flushed with excitement and righteous fury. "Forgive the interruption," he said, though his tone suggested he felt no need for forgiveness. "But there's something the council needs to know before proceeding." Patrick's expression darkened. "This is a private assessment, Bobbie." "Is it?" Bobbie's eyes gleamed with triumph. "Because the pack has voted, Patrick. We've decided that your judgment regarding this situation can no longer be trusted." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Alpha Nathaniel looked between Patrick and Bobbie with growing interest. "What kind of vote?" he asked. "A formal challenge to Alpha authority," Bobbie announced, his voice carrying clearly through the room. "Based on evidence of compromised judgment and supernatural influence." Betty felt the blood drain from her face. A formal challenge meant combat, potentially to the death. "You can't be serious," she whispered. Bobbie turned his attention to her, his expression mixing pity with disgust. "I've never been more serious. This pack has suffered long enough under the influence of your abilities. It's time to set things right." "Bobbie, don't do this," Betty pleaded, stepping forward. "I'll leave. I'll go wherever you want, just don't—" "No." Patrick's voice cut through her words like a blade. "You're not going anywhere." "Patrick, please." Betty turned to him, desperation clear in her voice. "Don't let your pride destroy everything. Don't fight him over me." Patrick's golden eyes blazed with an intensity that made her step back. "You think this is about pride?" "Isn't it?" Betty's voice cracked. "Isn't this just two males fighting over territory?" "This," Patrick said, moving closer to her, "is about the fact that you're my mate, my responsibility, my choice. And I'll be damned if I let anyone, Bobbie, the council, or anyone else, tell me I can't protect what's mine." The possessive declaration sent shivers down Betty's spine, but she could see the trap closing around them. Patrick's refusal to back down, combined with Bobbie's challenge, left only one possible outcome. "The challenge is formally issued," Bobbie announced, his voice carrying the weight of ancient ritual. "I, Beta Bobbie of the Silverfang Pack, challenge Alpha Patrick for leadership, claiming his judgment has been compromised by supernatural influence and that he no longer serves the pack's best interests." Alpha Nathaniel leaned forward, clearly intrigued by this development. "And the terms?" "Traditional combat," Bobbie replied. "Shifted form, to submission or death. Winner takes leadership and decides the fate of the moon-marked." Betty's heart stopped. To submission or death. Either Patrick would be humiliated and stripped of authority, or one of them would die. "I accept," Patrick said quietly, and Betty felt her world tilt sideways. "No," she breathed. "Patrick, no. Please." But it was too late. The ancient words had been spoken, the challenge formally issued and accepted. The Council Alphas exchanged glances that spoke of anticipation mixed with professional interest. "The duel will take place at sunset," Alpha Nathaniel declared. "Under the witness of Moon and Pack, may the strongest lead." As the room erupted in discussion about logistics and rules, Betty found herself staring at Patrick, seeing the man she might love preparing to risk everything for reasons she couldn't fully understand. "Why?" she whispered, moving close enough that only he could hear. Patrick's hand found hers, his fingers intertwining with hers despite the watching eyes of the council. "Because some things are worth fighting for," he said quietly. "And you're worth everything." The words should have been romantic, but all Betty could think about was the very real possibility that by nightfall, one of the men in this room would be dead. And it would be her fault. Chapter 17. The Duel Under the Moon. The clearing chosen for the duel was the same one where Betty had been rejected and claimed just days before. A circular space surrounded by ancient trees, now filled with the entire Silverfang Pack and the visiting council alphas. Torches had been lit around the perimeter, casting dancing shadows that made the gathering feel more like a prehistoric ritual than a modern dispute. Betty stood with Jason at the edge of the circle, her hands clenched so tightly her nails drew blood from her palms. The silver mark on her wrist burned with agitation, responding to her emotional turmoil with faint pulses of light that she tried desperately to suppress. In the center of the clearing, Patrick and Bobbie faced each other across 10 feet of trampled earth. Both had stripped to the waist, their skin gleaming with sweat despite the cool evening air. The contrast between them was stark. Patrick lean and controlled, every movement precise and economical, while Bobbie radiated barely contained fury, his muscles bunched with tension. "The challenge has been issued and accepted," Alpha Nathaniel announced, his voice carrying clearly across the silent gathering. "Combat will continue until one yields or dies. Are both parties prepared?" Patrick nodded once, his golden eyes never leaving Bobbie's face. The beta grinned, showing too many teeth. "More than ready," Bobbie replied. "Time to free this pack from unnatural influence." Betty felt sick. This was madness. Two men destroying each other over prophecies and politics while she stood helpless on the sidelines. "Begin," Alpha Nathaniel commanded. Both men shifted simultaneously, their human forms dissolving into something wilder and infinitely more dangerous. Patrick's wolf was larger, midnight black with eyes that glowed like molten gold in the torchlight. But Bobbie's wolf was built for fighting, scarred from previous battles, teeth bared in a snarl that promised violence. They circled each other warily, looking for openings, testing reactions. The pack watched in absolute silence, understanding that they were witnessing something that would reshape their world, regardless of outcome. Bobbie struck first, lunging forward with snapping jaws aimed at Patrick's throat. The alpha twisted aside, using Bobbie's momentum against him to send the beta tumbling into the dirt. But Bobbie rolled and came up snarling, already preparing his next attack. The fight that followed was brutal and primal. Claws raked through fur and flesh, drawing lines of blood that gleamed black in the firelight. Fangs clicked against bone as both wolves sought the killing grip that would end the combat. They crashed together with impacts that shook the ground, neither giving quarter. Patrick was the superior fighter. That much was clear from the beginning. His movements were fluid where Bobbie's were desperate, controlled where his opponent was wild. But Bobbie had one advantage. He had nothing left to lose. The beta fought with the fury of a man whose entire world had been torn away from him. His rejection, his humiliation, his loss of status, all of it channeled into claws and fangs that sought to destroy the source of his pain. And slowly, impossibly, that desperation began to tell. Patrick was holding back, Betty realized with growing horror. Even in this life-or-death struggle, he was trying not to kill Bobbie. His attacks were precise but not fatal, seeking to subdue rather than destroy. Bobbie had no such compunctions. The beta's claws found their mark across Patrick's shoulder, sending the alpha stumbling. Bobbie pressed his advantage, driving Patrick backward toward the edge of the circle. Blood flowed freely from wounds on both wolves, but Patrick's injuries seemed deeper, more debilitating. "He's losing," Margaret whispered somewhere behind Betty. "The alpha is actually losing." Betty felt her world narrowing to the two struggling forms in the center of the clearing. Patrick stumbled again, favoring his left foreleg, and Bobbie's snarl of triumph carried clearly across the silent crowd. This couldn't happen. Patrick couldn't lose, couldn't die, couldn't be stripped of everything he'd built because he'd chosen to protect her. The thought of Bobbie as alpha, of the vengeance he'd wreak once Patrick was gone, made Betty's chest tight with panic. But more than that, the thought of Patrick hurt, broken, possibly dead because of her was unbearable. Without conscious thought, Betty stepped forward. Jason's hand caught her arm, trying to hold her back, but she shook him off with surprising strength. "Betty, no!" Jason hissed. "You can't interfere in a formal challenge." But Betty was already moving, pushing through the crowd toward the circle's edge. The silver mark on her wrist was blazing now, visible even through her sleeve, responding to her desperate need to help. In the center of the clearing, Bobbie landed a devastating blow that sent Patrick crashing to the ground. The alpha rolled, trying to regain his footing, but Bobbie was already airborne, descending with claws extended toward Patrick's exposed throat. Time seemed to slow. Betty saw the arc of Bobbie's attack, saw Patrick's golden eyes wide with the knowledge that he wouldn't be able to dodge in time, saw the moment when everything she cared about was about to be destroyed, and something inside her snapped. "Enough!" Chapter 18, The Voice of Mercy. The word exploded from Betty's throat with the force of a thunderclap, carrying power that had nothing to do with volume and everything to do with the divine authority flowing through her voice. Silver light erupted from her skin like a star going nova, washing over the clearing in waves of pure celestial energy. Every wolf in the gathering, Alpha, Beta, Omega, froze mid-breath as the power crashed over them. Bobbie's attack stopped in mid-air, his wolf form suspended impossibly above Patrick as if caught in amber. His eyes were wide with shock and something that might have been terror. Patrick lay motionless on the ground, his golden gaze fixed on Betty with an expression of wonder and recognition that made her chest ache. The entire pack had gone silent, staring at the Omega, who blazed like captured moonlight in the center of their world. "This pack was meant for more than blood and pride," Betty said, and her voice carried the weight of centuries, the authority of the moon goddess herself speaking through mortal lips. "You were meant to be healers, protectors, bridges between the human and divine worlds. Instead, you've become exactly what you once fought against, creatures ruled by fear and violence." She stepped into the circle, and with each footstep, silver light poured from her, transforming the bare earth into something that sparkled like stardust. The torches around the perimeter flared brighter, as if responding to her presence. "Look at yourselves," Betty continued, her gaze sweeping across the frozen crowd. "Look at what you've become. Two males tearing each other apart while their people watch like vultures waiting for carrion. This is not strength. This is weakness masquerading as tradition." Bobbie's suspended form began to tremble, his wolf's eyes showing white around the edges. But he couldn't move, couldn't speak, held in place by power that dwarfed anything he'd ever experienced. "You fear me because I'm different," Betty said, turning her attention to the broader pack. "Because I carry power you don't understand. But the real danger isn't in my bloodline. It's in the hatred and suspicion you've allowed to poison your hearts." She knelt beside Patrick's prone form, her hands hovering over his wounds. Silver light flowed from her palms, knitting torn flesh and mending broken bones with the casual ease of breathing. "I didn't choose to be moon-marked," she said as she worked, her voice carrying to every corner of the clearing. "I didn't ask for these abilities or the responsibility they carry, but I refuse to apologize for what I am, and I refuse to let your fear turn me into the monster you've decided I must be." Patrick's eyes fluttered as the healing power flowed through him, repairing damage that should have taken weeks to heal. When he tried to sit up, Betty's hand on his chest kept him still. "And you," she said, her voice gentling as she looked down at him. "You magnificent, stubborn, impossible man. Did you really think I was worth dying for?" Patrick's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. every day and twice on Sundays. Despite everything, the violence, the fear, the cosmic forces swirling around them, Betty felt laughter bubble up in her chest. "You're insane." "Probably." Patrick's hand covered hers where it rested on his chest. "Does that change anything?" Betty looked down at him, this alpha who'd risked everything for her, and felt the last of her doubts crumble away. Prophecy or no prophecy, destiny or choice, what she felt for him was real. What they had together was worth fighting for. "No," she said softly. "It doesn't change anything." She turned back to the crowd, her expression hardening as she focused on the wolves who'd demanded this trial by combat. "The challenge is over," she announced, and her voice carried absolute authority. "There will be no more bloodshed tonight, no more violence born of fear and ignorance." She gestured, and Bobbie's suspended form slowly lowered to the ground. The moment his paws touched earth, he shifted back to human form, gasping and shaking as the paralysis released him. "Bobbie," Betty said, and he flinched at the sound of his name. "You've spent so much energy trying to destroy what you don't understand. What would happen if you used that passion to build something instead?" The former Beta stared at her, his face cycling through emotions too fast to track. You could have killed me. While I was frozen, you could have ended this." "I could have," Betty agreed. "But killing you wouldn't heal the fear that drives you. It would only prove that you were right to be afraid." She stood, her silver glow slowly fading but never disappearing entirely. When she looked around the clearing, she saw something she'd never expected to see in the eyes of the Silverfang Pack. Reverence. One by one, starting with Carlos and spreading through the crowd like ripples on a pond, the pack members dropped to their knees. Not in submission, but in recognition. In acknowledgement of power that came not from dominance, but from compassion. Even the council alphas knelt, their faces showing the kind of awe usually reserved for religious experiences. "Rise," Betty said gently. "All of you. I'm not your goddess. I'm your sister, your packmate, your friend, if you'll have me." She helped Patrick to his feet, noting how his wounds had healed completely, leaving only silver scars that matched the ones on her own wrist. "The challenge is finished," Patrick announced, his voice carrying across the clearing. "Bobbie fought with honor, and I respect his courage even if I disagree with his conclusions." Bobbie straightened, his expression conflicted. I'm sorry, Alpha. I let fear make me into something I don't like." "Fear makes fools of us all sometimes," Patrick replied. "The question is what we do next." Betty stepped forward, addressing the entire pack. "What we do next is simple. We choose to be better. We choose to let compassion guide us instead of suspicion. We choose to build bridges instead of walls." She paused, looking around at the faces surrounding her, some still afraid, others hopeful, all changed by what they'd witnessed. "The moon goddess gave me these abilities for a reason," she continued. "Not to rule over you, but to serve alongside you, to heal what's broken and protect what's precious." Alpha Nathaniel rose from his kneeling position, his expression thoughtful. "I believe we've seen enough to make our assessment," he said formally. "Alpha Patrick's judgment appears sound, and the Omega shows no signs of malicious intent." "More than that," Alpha Elena added, her voice filled with wonder. "She shows wisdom beyond her years, and power tempered by mercy. The old stories spoke of such wolves, but I never thought to see one with my own eyes." As the crowd began to disperse, chattering excitedly about what they'd witnessed, Betty felt a hand slip into hers. Patrick's fingers intertwined with hers, solid and warm and reassuringly real. "So," he said quietly, "what happens now?" Betty looked up at him, seeing her own hopes reflected in his golden eyes. "Now we figure out how to be ourselves while serving something larger than ourselves." "Together?" "Together," she confirmed, and knew with absolute certainty that whatever came next, they would face it side by side. The prophecy had been fulfilled, but not in the way anyone expected. The Moon-Marked had returned not as a conquering force, but as a healer. Not as a ruler, but as a servant. And in choosing mercy over dominance, compassion over fear, she had transformed not just herself, but an entire pack. The real test, Betty knew, would be living up to the example she'd just set. But for tonight, it was enough to stand beneath the silver moon with the man she loved, surrounded by a pack that was learning to choose hope over fear. It was enough to be exactly who she was meant to be. Chapter 19. The Confession Unearthed. The pack was still buzzing with energy from the previous night's revelations when Jason made his discovery. He'd been unable to sleep, his mind replaying the image of Betty blazing with silver light, the sound of her voice carrying divine authority. Something about the night's events had left him feeling unsettled, not about Betty, but about his own role in nearly destroying an innocent woman. He'd returned to the archives seeking answers, but what he found instead was evidence of betrayal that ran deeper than anyone had imagined. Hidden behind the genealogy records, tucked into a space so narrow it was almost invisible, was a small leather journal. Unlike the ancient prophecies, this one was recent, the ink still dark, the pages barely yellowed. When Jason opened it, his blood ran cold. Day 47 since the Williams woman's arrival. Her healing abilities grow stronger, more obvious. The Alpha's son recovers too quickly from ailments that should have lasted weeks. If she continues to display such power openly, questions will be asked. Jason's hands trembled as he turned the page. I've convinced Elder Thomas that her methods are unconventional, that herbs alone cannot account for her success. Fear is a powerful tool when used correctly. Day 52. The Alpha grows suspicious. Today he asks direct questions about Sarah's background, her training. I deflected, but his concern is mounting. Perhaps it's time to take more decisive action. Day 58. I've planted evidence in her quarters. Dark herbs known for their poisonous properties, strange symbols drawn in what appears to be blood. When the Alpha's son next falls ill, I'll ensure Sarah's cure seems to make him worse before it makes him better. Jason felt sick. This wasn't ancient history. This was a first-hand account of framing an innocent woman. Day 61. It's done. The boy nearly died from the poison I gave him, disguised as medicine from Sarah. When she tried to heal him with her true power, I made sure the Alpha walked in at the crucial moment. The sight of silver light pouring from her hands was all the proof he needed. He ordered her execution immediately. She begged for time to say goodbye to her daughter, but I convinced him that delay would only allow her to corrupt more pack members. Sometimes mercy must be set aside for the greater good. The Williams line ends tonight. The pack will be safer without their unnatural influence. The journal was signed with initials that made Jason's stomach lurch. R.B. Robert Bobbie. Jason flipped through more pages, finding detailed accounts of how Bobbie had manipulated evidence, influenced witnesses, and convinced the former Alpha that Sarah Williams posed a deadly threat to pack security. It was a masterpiece of political manipulation, and it had cost an innocent woman her life. But the final entry was the most damning of all. The healer Marcus died last night. Natural causes, the pack believes, but I know better. He'd begun to question Sarah's guilt, to investigate her claims of innocence. A small amount of the same poison that nearly killed the Alpha's son ensured his silence would be permanent. With both Sarah and Marcus dead, there are no witnesses left to contradict the official story. The pack will remember Sarah Williams as a would-be murderer who tried to kill their Alpha's child. Her daughter will grow up believing her mother was a monster. Sometimes the hardest decisions are the right ones. I sleep peacefully knowing I've protected our people from a threat they never even understood. Jason closed the journal with shaking hands. Bobbie hadn't just framed Sarah Williams. He'd murdered the pack's healer to cover his tracks. 2 innocent people were dead because of his paranoia and ambition. And now he'd tried to do the same thing to Betty. Jason grabbed the journal and ran from the archives, his heart pounding with the urgency of revelation. The pack needed to know the truth. Betty needed to know that her mother had died innocent, a martyr to one man's fear and manipulation. He burst into the morning council meeting without ceremony, the journal clutched in his white-knuckled grip. Patrick looked up from the table where he sat with the visiting alphas, his expression shifting from annoyance to concern as he saw Jason's face. "What is it?" Patrick asked immediately. "I found something," Jason gasped, still breathing hard from his run. "About Sarah Williams, about what really happened 17 years ago." The room went silent. Alpha Nathaniel leaned forward with interest while Patrick rose from his chair, tension radiating from every line of his body. "Show me," Patrick commanded. Jason placed the journal on the table and opened it to the first damning entry. As Patrick read, his expression grew darker with each line. The visiting alphas peered over his shoulder, their faces reflecting growing horror. "This is Bobbie's handwriting," Patrick said quietly, his voice deadly calm. "His confession," Jason confirmed. "He framed Sarah Williams, poisoned the alpha's son himself, then made it look like her healing attempt was what nearly killed the boy. And when the pack healer started asking questions," Jason's voice trailed off. "He murdered him too," Alpha Elena finished, her voice filled with disgust. Patrick's hands clenched into fists around the journal's edges. "Where is he?" "I don't know," Jason admitted. "I came straight here." "Find him," Patrick ordered, his voice carrying absolute authority. "Bring him to the main hall. Now." But before Jason could move, the door burst open again. This time it was Carlos, his face pale with urgency. "Alpha," he gasped. "You need to come quickly. It's Bobbie. He's in the village center addressing the pack. He's telling them that last night was a trick, that Betty used dark magic to make herself seem benevolent." Patrick's expression turned murderous. "Is Betty with him?" "No, she's still at your house. But Alpha?" Carlos swallowed hard. "He's convincing people. He's saying that her power proved she's dangerous, that she stopped the fight because she needed you alive to maintain her influence." "How many believe him?" Alpha Nathaniel asked sharply. "Enough," Carlos replied grimly. "Maybe half the pack. The others are confused, but they're listening." Patrick stood, the journal still in his hands. Then it's time they heard the truth. The walk to the village center felt like a march to execution. Word had spread quickly about the emergency gathering, and wolves emerged from their homes to join the growing crowd. Betty appeared at Patrick's side as they passed his house, her face drawn with worry. "What's happening?" she asked quietly. Patrick handed her the journal without a word. As she read, her face went through the same progression of emotions he'd experienced: shock, horror, and finally, a deep sadness that made his chest ache. "My mother," she whispered. "She really was innocent." "More than innocent," Patrick said firmly. "She was a hero, and Bobbie murdered her for it." They reached the village center to find Bobbie standing on the raised platform used for pack announcements, his voice carrying clearly across the gathered crowd. "I know what you saw last night looked impressive," he was saying, "but consider this. If she truly wanted peace, why did she wait until the fight was nearly over? Why let it go so far before intervening?" "Because she was enjoying the violence," Margaret called out from the crowd, "feeding off our conflict." Several pack members nodded agreement, their faces showing the fear and suspicion that Bobbie's words had rekindled. "Exactly," Bobbie said with satisfaction. "She allowed our alpha to nearly die because the spectacle served her purposes. Only when she was certain of maximum impact did she reveal her true power." "That's enough." Patrick's voice cut across the gathering like a blade. The crowd parted as he walked forward, the journal held high for all to see. Bobbie's face went pale as he recognized what Patrick carried. "The pack deserves to hear the truth," Patrick continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the square. "All of it." He climbed onto the platform, facing the crowd, while Bobbie retreated to the far edge. 17 years ago, an innocent woman died in this territory. Sarah Williams was executed for crimes she didn't commit. branded a traitor and would-be murderer based on evidence that was fabricated by the man standing behind me. The crowd stirred uneasily. This wasn't the dramatic confrontation they'd expected. "I have here Bobbie's own confession," Patrick announced, opening the journal. Written in his hand, detailing how he framed Sarah Williams, how he poisoned the former Alpha's son and made it appear that Sarah's healing attempt was responsible. Gasps rippled through the gathering. Bobbie's face had gone from pale to ashen. "That's not... You can't prove..." Bobbie started, but Patrick's voice cut through his protests. "He also confesses to murdering Marcus, our healer, when the man began investigating Sarah's claims of innocence." Patrick's voice carried across the sudden silence. "Two innocent people died to feed one man's paranoia and ambition." The crowd erupted in angry voices. Pack members who'd trusted Bobbie's version of events now stared at him with revulsion and fury. "You killed Marcus?" Elena the baker's voice cracked with grief. "He was my brother. You looked me in the eye at his funeral and offered comfort." "I had to protect the pack," Bobbie said desperately, his carefully constructed facade finally cracking. "You don't understand what the moon-marked represent. The corruption they bring." "The only corruption here," Betty said, stepping onto the platform beside Patrick, "came from fear and hatred. My mother died innocent, and you've spent 17 years building lies on her grave." She faced the crowd, her silver mark glowing faintly through her sleeve. "Last night you saw what I really am. Not a manipulator or a threat, but someone willing to stop violence even when it would have served my interests to let it continue." "She's right," Carlos called out from the crowd. "She healed the Alpha when she could have let him die. She showed mercy to the man who challenged her protector." More voices joined in agreement, the pack's sentiment shifting as the truth sank in. Bobbie looked around frantically, seeing his support evaporating like smoke. "No," he said, backing toward the edge of the platform. "You're all being deceived. Can't you see what she's doing? She's using her power right now, making you believe—" "The only thing she's making us believe," Jason interrupted, stepping forward with his own voice raised, "is that we were fools to trust you." Bobbie's expression twisted with rage and desperation. He'd lost everything, his position, his reputation, his future, and the woman he blamed for it all stood just feet away, bathed in silver light and surrounded by the loyalty he'd tried so hard to destroy. "If I can't save you from her," he snarled, "then at least I can save you from yourselves." His hand moved to the knife at his belt with desperate speed, the blade flashing in the morning sunlight as he lunged not at Patrick, but at Betty herself. The pack's horrified screams filled the air as steel arced toward the moon-marked woman who'd shown them mercy when she could have chosen vengeance. Chapter 20. The Final Betrayal. Time fractured into crystalline moments of horror and heroism. Betty saw the knife coming, saw Bobbie's face twisted with desperate hatred, saw the morning sun catch the blade's edge as it arced toward her heart. Her silver light flared instinctively, but she knew it wouldn't be enough. Healing power was useless against a strike meant to kill instantly. She had perhaps a heartbeat to react, to try stepping back or throwing herself aside. Instead, she found herself frozen by the terrible realization that even now, even after everything, she felt sorry for the broken man trying to murder her. But Patrick moved like lightning given flesh. He threw himself between them with the fluid grace of a wolf protecting his mate, his body becoming a shield that absorbed the blow meant for Betty. The knife that would have pierced her heart instead slid between his ribs, finding the gap in his guard with deadly precision. Patrick's breath left him in a sharp gasp as steel found its mark. His golden eyes met Betty's for one impossible moment. Not with pain, but with relief that she was safe. Then he collapsed. Betty's scream tore from her throat with a sound that had never been human, a cry of anguish that silenced birds in the surrounding forest and sent every wolf in the village to their knees. The silver light that had been a gentle glow exploded outward like a star going nova, washing over the platform in waves of pure divine energy. "Patrick!" She dropped beside his fallen form, her hands immediately pressing against the wound that pulsed blood with each weakening heartbeat. The knife had found something vital. She could see it in the way his breathing was growing shallow, the way his skin was already taking on the pallor of approaching death. "No, no, no," she whispered, her power pouring into him in desperate waves. "You don't get to die for me, you don't get to leave me alone." But the wound was too severe, the damage too extensive. Even her considerable abilities struggled against the reality of mortal injury. She could slow the dying, but she couldn't stop it, not when his life was flowing out faster than she could channel it back in. "Betty." Patrick's voice was barely a whisper. Blood flecked his lips as he tried to speak. "Don't waste your strength." "Shut up," she said fiercely, tears streaming down her face as she fought to keep him anchored to life. "Just shut up and let me work." Around them, the pack had erupted into chaos. Voices shouted for healers, for help, for someone to do something. Jason's roar of fury echoed across the square as he grabbed Bobbie, who stood staring at the blood on his hands with dawning horror. "What have you done?" Jason snarled, shaking the former Beta like a rag doll. "What have you done?" But Betty heard none of it. Her entire world had narrowed to the man dying in her arms, to the impossible task of holding his soul in his body long enough to find a way to save him. "I'm sorry," Patrick whispered, his hand finding hers with trembling fingers. "I'm so sorry, Betty. I promised to protect you, and now—" "You did protect me," she said, her voice breaking. "You saved me, but I need you to stay with me now, do you understand? I need you to fight." Patrick's smile was heartbreakingly gentle. "Can't fight this one. But Betty, what we had, it was real. All of it, the prophecy, didn't make me love you. It just showed me who I was supposed to find." The confession hit her like another knife, this one aimed at her heart. All her doubts about fate versus choice, all her fears about whether their bond was genuine, crumbled away in the face of his dying words. "I love you too," she whispered, leaning down to press her forehead against his. "I love you, and I refuse to let you go." Patrick's breathing hitched, his eyes starting to lose focus. "Have to. The pack needs both of us," Betty said fiercely. "Don't you dare give up on me now." But she could feel him slipping away despite her efforts, could sense his spirit preparing to leave the flesh that could no longer sustain it. In desperation, she reached deeper into her power than she'd ever gone before, calling on every scrap of divine energy that flowed through her bloodline. Still, it wasn't enough. The wound was too severe, the blood loss too extensive. Patrick's heart was failing despite her attempts to strengthen it, his lungs filling with fluid that her power couldn't clear fast enough. In desperation, Betty lifted her head toward the sky where the moon hung pale against the morning light. "Please," she whispered, her voice carrying across the sudden silence that had fallen over the pack. "Moon Goddess, if you're listening, if this bloodline means anything to you, please don't let him die. I'll do anything. I'll serve anyone you want, go anywhere you command. Just please don't take him from me." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Power poured down from the heavens like liquid starlight, flooding through Betty with an intensity that made her previous displays seem like candle flames compared to the sun. Every nerve in her body blazed with divine energy as the moon goddess herself answered her desperate prayer. But the power came with a price. She could feel it burning through her mortal flesh, consuming her humanity as it sought to save the man she loved. To channel this much divine energy would transform her completely, turn her into something more than wolf, more than human. She would become an avatar of the goddess herself, powerful beyond imagining but no longer truly mortal. Betty looked down at Patrick's fading features and knew she would pay any price to save him. "I accept," she whispered. The transformation began immediately. Chapter 21. The Blood Moon. Bond silver fire consumed Betty's mortal form as divine power reshaped her from the inside out. Her human limitations burned away like dross in a crucible, leaving something purer and infinitely more powerful in their place. The pack watched in stunned silence as their Omega transcended mortality before their eyes. Betty's hair became liquid starlight, flowing around her shoulders like captured moonbeams. Her skin took on a luminescence that made her appear carved from pearl and silver, while her eyes blazed with the ancient wisdom of the moon goddess herself. She was no longer simply moon-marked. She had become the moon's living vessel. "Patrick," she said, and her voice carried harmonics that resonated in the bones of every wolf present. "Come back to me." She placed her transformed hands on his chest, and power beyond description flowed into his dying body. Not just healing energy, but the fundamental force of life itself, the divine spark that separated the living from the dead. Patrick's wounds closed instantly, flesh knitting together without leaving even a scar. His breathing deepened and strengthened as damaged organs regenerated completely. But more than physical healing was taking place. Betty was rewriting the very fabric of his being, making him something more than he had been. "Betty," Patrick gasped, his eyes flying open as divine energy flooded through him. "What are you doing?" "Saving you," she replied simply. "All of you." The power continued to pour from her, but now it spread beyond Patrick to encompass the entire pack. Every wolf in the square felt the touch of the goddess's grace. Old injuries healed, chronic pains vanished, and the spiritual wounds left by years of division and mistrust began to close. But the most profound change was in Patrick himself. As Betty's power flowed through him, she could feel their bond shifting, deepening, becoming something unprecedented in wolf history. He wasn't just being healed, he was being elevated, transformed into a perfect complement to her divine nature. When the light finally faded, Patrick rose from the platform not as the same man who had fallen, but as something new. His golden eyes now held flecks of silver that matched Betty's radiance, and when he moved, it was with a fluid grace that spoke of supernatural enhancement. He was still an alpha, but now he was also something more. The earthly anchor for a divine being, the bridge between mortal wolf and goddess. "The bond is complete," Betty said softly, her transformed voice carrying across the silent square. "Alpha and Luna, mortal and divine, united as the prophecies foretold." She looked around at the pack that had gathered to watch their confrontation, seeing them with eyes that held both human compassion and divine understanding. "Bobbie," she said, turning to where the former Beta knelt in Jason's grip, his face wet with tears of remorse and terror. "I'm sorry," Bobbie whispered, his voice broken. "I'm so sorry. I never meant. I was so afraid." "I know," Betty replied, and there was infinite compassion in her transformed features. "Fear makes us do terrible things, but fear can also be overcome." She gestured, and silver light flowed from her fingers to envelop Bobbie's trembling form. But instead of punishment, he found healing, not just of body, but of the paranoia and hatred that had consumed his heart for so long. "You framed my mother and murdered an innocent healer," Betty continued, her voice carrying both justice and mercy. "Those crimes demand consequence, but they don't define who you have to be from this moment forward." Bobbie looked up at her with wonder, feeling the burden of his hatred lifting like a weight being removed from his shoulders. What happens to me now?" "That's your choice," Betty said simply. "You can leave this territory and never return, starting fresh somewhere else. Or you can stay and work to make amends for the harm you've caused. Either way, the cycle of vengeance ends here." She turned to address the pack as a whole, her radiance casting everything in silver light that seemed to come from within rather than without. The prophecies spoke of a choice between light and shadow, salvation and damnation. That choice was never mine alone. It belonged to all of us. Today, we choose compassion over fear, unity over division, healing over destruction. One by one, the pack members dropped to their knees, not in submission but in recognition of the divine presence that walked among them. Even the visiting council alphas knelt, understanding that they were witnessing something that would be spoken of in legends for generations to come. Patrick moved to stand beside her, his own transformation evident in the way he carried himself. No longer just an alpha ruling through strength, he had become the perfect balance to her divine authority, wisdom to temper her power, humanity to ground her divinity. "Rise," Betty said gently. "All of you. We are family, not subjects and ruler. The age of dominance through fear is ending. What begins now is an era of leadership through service." As the pack slowly rose, Betty felt the final pieces of the ancient prophecy clicking into place. She had indeed become the bridge between mortal and divine, the healer who would unite what had been divided. But the price had been steep. She was no longer simply Betty Williams, the rejected Omega who'd found unexpected love. She was now the moon's avatar, carrying responsibilities that stretched far beyond a single pack's welfare. "Will you regret it?" Patrick asked quietly, moving close enough that only she could hear. "Giving up your humanity for this?" Betty looked at him. This man who'd risked everything for her, who'd literally died rather than let her be harmed, and smiled with infinite tenderness. "I didn't give up my humanity," she said softly. "I transformed it into something larger. And as long as you're with me, I'll never forget what it means to be mortal." Patrick's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining as silver light danced between their palms. The bond between them pulsed with power that was both earthly and divine, a connection that would endure beyond death itself. "Together?" he asked, echoing her words from what felt like a lifetime ago. "Together," Betty confirmed, "for as long as the moon shines and the wolves run free." Above them, the morning sky began to shift and change. Clouds gathered from a clear sky, and the pale moon that had been barely visible suddenly blazed like a beacon. The pack looked up in wonder as day briefly became twilight, allowing the moon goddess to bless their union with her visible presence. The blood moon ritual was complete. The moon-marked had returned not as conqueror but as healer, and the pack that had once rejected her now stood ready to follow her into whatever future awaited. Betty Williams, the servant girl who'd been mocked and cast aside, was gone forever. In her place stood something new, a leader who would guide not through fear, but through love, who would protect not through dominance, but through sacrifice. The prophecy was fulfilled, but the real story was just beginning. Chapter 22. Justice of the Moon. The formal proceedings began 3 days after the blood moon ritual, when the pack had finally processed the magnitude of what had occurred. Betty stood in the great hall, no longer as a powerless Omega, but as Luna, her divine radiance casting silver patterns across the ancient stone walls. The transformation in the pack's dynamics was already visible. Where once rigid hierarchies had divided wolves into separate castes, now there was a sense of equality that hadn't existed in living memory. Omegas sat beside betas without deference, while alphas mingled freely with those they'd once considered beneath their notice. But justice still needed to be served. Bobbie knelt in the center of the hall, flanked by 2 guards but no longer bound. The silver light Betty had used to heal his poisoned heart had also stripped away his capacity for deception. He could no longer hide behind lies or manipulation. "Robert Bobbie," Patrick announced formally, his enhanced voice carrying easily across the gathering. "You stand accused of murder, conspiracy, and treason against the pack. How do you answer these charges?" "Guilty," Bobbie replied quietly. His voice was hollow but steady. "To all of them. I murdered Marcus because he threatened to expose my lies. I framed Sarah Williams because I feared what she represented, and I betrayed this pack's trust for 17 years. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Despite the evidence they'd seen, hearing the confessions spoken aloud still carried weight. "The penalty for murder has traditionally been death," Elder Marcus said gravely. "The penalty for treason, exile. Both crimes combined would normally result in execution." Betty stepped forward, her transformed presence immediately commanding attention. Traditional penalties assume traditional circumstances. We are no longer bound by the old ways of dominance and retribution. She approached Bobbie, who flinched slightly but didn't try to retreat. When she knelt beside him, bringing herself to his eye level, the gesture sent shockwaves through wolves who'd never seen such humility from someone in power. "You've carried fear and hatred in your heart for so long that they became poison," Betty said gently. "That poison drove you to terrible acts, but it also made you suffer every day for years." Bobbie's eyes filled with tears. "I don't deserve mercy. Not after what I've done." "Mercy isn't about deserving," Betty replied. "It's about choosing to break cycles of pain rather than perpetuate them. My mother died because of your actions, but killing you won't bring her back. It will only create more grief, more loss." She placed her glowing hand on his shoulder, and Bobbie gasped as warmth flowed through him, not healing his body but soothing the spiritual wounds that had festered for decades. "Your rank is stripped," Patrick announced. "Your place in this pack is forfeited. But you will live, and you will have the chance to make different choices." "Exile?" Bobbie asked quietly. "That's your decision to make," Betty said, rising gracefully. "You can leave and start fresh elsewhere, carrying the lessons you've learned. Or you can stay and work to make amends, not as a ranked wolf but as someone committed to healing the damage you've caused." The offer stunned the gathering. To allow a confessed murderer to remain in the territory was unprecedented, a mercy that went beyond even divine compassion. "If I stay," Bobbie said slowly, "what would that mean?" "It would mean serving those you've wronged," Betty replied. "Caring for the elderly who remember Marcus fondly, helping to teach young wolves about the dangers of letting fear guide their actions, living each day as proof that even the most broken hearts can be healed." Bobbie was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with the magnitude of the choice before him. Finally, he spoke. "I'll stay. I'll try to earn forgiveness, even though I know I may never deserve it." Betty smiled, and the expression transformed her divine features with recognizable humanity. "Then you've already taken the first step." She turned to address the broader assembly. "Justice isn't about punishment, it's about restoration. We restore what was broken, heal what was wounded, and build something better from the pieces of what came before." Patrick stepped forward to stand beside her. "The pack's leadership structure changes today. Jason will serve as Beta not because he's earned the right to dominance, but because he's demonstrated wisdom and loyalty." Jason rose from his seat, his expression solemn. "I accept the responsibility, but not the authority. In the new order, leadership serves rather than rules. All positions of influence will be earned through service to others," Betty continued. "Alpha, Beta, or Omega, these are roles, not rankings. Each wolf contributes according to their abilities and receives according to their needs." Elder Marcus struggled to his feet, his weathered face creased with wonder. "You're describing something that's never existed, a pack without hierarchy, without dominance structures." "Because it's time for something new," Patrick replied. "The old ways served their purpose, but they also created the conditions that allowed fear and hatred to flourish. We can do better." "What about other packs?" Alpha Nathaniel asked from his position among the visiting dignitaries. "How will you interact with territories that still follow traditional structures?" Betty's expression grew thoughtful. "We'll serve as an example, not by conquering or converting, but by demonstrating that there's another way. Other packs will decide for themselves what lessons to take from our experience." The formal proceedings continued for another hour, establishing new codes of conduct and methods for resolving disputes. But the real transformation had already taken place in the hearts and minds of the pack members themselves. As the assembly dispersed, Betty caught sight of Margaret helping Bobbie to his feet with gentle hands. The same woman who'd once called for Betty's exile was now showing compassion to the man who'd manipulated her fears. "Change happens one heart at a time," Patrick observed, following her gaze. "And it starts with choosing mercy over justice, forgiveness over revenge," Betty agreed. "Even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Looking around the hall at the faces of wolves who were learning to see each other as equals rather than competitors, Betty felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The prophecy had spoken of healing what was broken and uniting what was divided. For the first time, she could see that the real work was just beginning. Chapter 23. The Luna's Coronation. 7 days later, under a moon that blazed silver-white in a cloudless sky, the Silverfang Pack gathered for a ceremony unlike any in their history. The clearing where Betty had once been rejected and claimed had been transformed into a sacred space, decorated with flowers that seemed to glow with their own inner light. Every wolf from the territory was present, along with representatives from a dozen neighboring packs who'd come to witness the coronation of the first divine Luna in generations. Word had spread quickly through the supernatural community about the moon-marked woman who'd transcended mortality to save her mate and transform her people. Betty stood at the edge of the clearing, no longer nervous about being the center of attention. The divine transformation had brought with it a serene confidence that allowed her to face scrutiny without fear. She wore a dress of flowing silver that seemed to be cut from moonlight itself, while a circlet of white gold and pearls rested on her star-bright hair. But it was the mark on her palm that drew every eye. The crescent moon symbol that had once been barely visible on her wrist now blazed across her hand like a living brand, proclaiming her divine nature to anyone who looked upon her. "Are you ready for this?" Patrick asked, appearing at her side. He wore ceremonial robes that marked him as Alpha, but the silver threads woven through the fabric spoke of his new role as consort to a divine being. "I've been ready my entire life," Betty replied, surprising herself with the truth of the statement. "I just didn't know it until now." Patrick smiled, his golden eyes warm with love and pride. "The pack is fortunate to have you." "We're fortunate to have each other," Betty corrected gently. "All of us. That's what tonight is really about, acknowledging that we're stronger together than we ever were apart." The ceremony began with Elder Marcus calling the pack to witness, his voice carrying clearly across the hushed gathering. But this wasn't the formal, hierarchical ritual of previous coronations. Instead, it was a celebration of community, with pack members sharing stories of how Betty's transformation had already begun healing old wounds. Carlos spoke of his miraculous recovery, crediting not just Betty's healing power but her willingness to risk herself for someone she barely knew. Margaret tearfully described how Betty's example had helped her overcome years of prejudice and fear. Even some of the visiting pack representatives shared tales of how news of the Silverfang transformation was inspiring change in their own territories. When it came time for the actual coronation, Betty was surprised to find herself being approached not by Elder Marcus, but by the pack's children. A little girl named Anna, whom Betty had helped care for in the servant quarters, carried a crown woven from mountain flowers and silver wire. "We made this for you," Anna said shyly, holding up the delicate circlet. "Because you're our Luna now, and you should have something beautiful." Betty knelt to accept the crown, her divine composure wavering as tears threatened to spill down her cheeks. "It's perfect," she whispered. "Thank you." As Anna placed the flower crown on Betty's head, replacing the formal circlet, something magical happened. The simple wildflowers began to glow with the same silver light that radiated from Betty's mark, transforming a child's gift into something worthy of legends. "I, Betty Williams, accept the role of Luna, not to rule over you, but to serve alongside you," Betty announced, rising to address the pack. "I promise to use the gifts I've been given for healing rather than harming, for unity rather than division." Patrick stepped forward, taking her hand as the pack erupted in cheers and howls of celebration. "And I, Patrick Stone, promise to support our Luna's vision of a pack built on compassion rather than conquest, service rather than dominance." Together, they turned to face the blazing moon above, and as they did, something extraordinary occurred. The silver light radiating from Betty's mark spread to encompass Patrick as well, creating a visible bond of light that connected them not just to each other, but to every member of their pack. For one transcendent moment, every wolf in the clearing felt it. the absolute certainty that they belonged, that they were loved, that they had a place in something larger and more meaningful than they'd ever imagined possible. "Let this be our covenant," Betty called out, her voice carrying divine authority while remaining warmly human. "That no wolf in our territory goes hungry while others feast. That no child grows up believing they're worthless because of their birth rank. That strength is measured not by the ability to dominate others, but by the willingness to lift them up." The response was immediate and thunderous, not just from the Silverfang Pack, but from the visiting wolves who found themselves caught up in the moment's magic. Howls rose toward the moon in harmonious chorus, a sound of pure joy that could be heard for miles. As the formal ceremony concluded and the celebration began in earnest, Betty found herself surrounded by well-wishers and representatives from other territories. Several alpha females approached to ask about implementing similar reforms in their own packs, while young omegas from visiting groups looked at her with wonder and hope. "You've started something," Jason observed, appearing at her elbow with a cup of the specially brewed tea that had become traditional at pack celebrations. "We've started something," Betty corrected, accepting the drink gratefully. "And I have a feeling this is just the beginning." She looked around the clearing, watching Patrick dance with Anna and her young friends, seeing Bobbie helping serve food to the elderly pack members with quiet dedication, observing how naturally wolves from different territories mingled without regard for rank or status. The prophecy had spoken of healing what was broken and uniting what was divided. Looking at the scene before her, Betty could see that the real miracle wasn't her divine transformation. It was the simple recognition that love was stronger than fear, that compassion could triumph over hatred when given the chance. The flower crown on her head continued to glow with silver light, marking her as something unprecedented in wolf history, a leader chosen not for her ability to dominate, but for her willingness to serve. And in that service, she had found a power greater than any prophecy could have predicted. Chapter 24. The Echo of Laughter. Hours later, as the celebration wound down and the visiting packs prepared to return to their own territories, Betty and Patrick found themselves alone in the clearing where their story had begun. The moon hung directly overhead now, full and radiant, casting everything in silver light that seemed to respond to Betty's divine presence. "Do you ever think about that night?" Patrick asked quietly, settling beside her on the fallen log where she'd once sat broken and humiliated. "About how different things might have been if Bobbie hadn't rejected you so publicly?" Betty considered the question, tracing patterns in the moonlit earth with her glowing fingertip. "Sometimes. But I think it needed to happen exactly as it did. The public rejection, the dramatic claiming, all of it. If you'd simply approached me quietly later, would I have believed your interest was genuine?" "And the pack needed to see the transformation," Patrick agreed. "From rejection to divine acceptance. It's become part of the story they'll tell their children." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, listening to the distant sounds of the pack settling down for the night. Laughter drifted from the village, but it was warm and inclusive now, so different from the cruel mockery that had once driven Betty to tears. "I was thinking about my mother today," Betty said softly, "about how she died believing her daughter would grow up thinking she was a monster. She never could have imagined this." Patrick's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining as silver light danced between their palms. "She'd be proud of you, not just for what you've become, but for how you chose to use the power when it came." "Do you think she's watching?" Betty asked, looking up at the moon that had once seemed so distant and cold. "Do you think she knows what happened?" As if in answer to her question, the moonlight seemed to intensify for a moment, and Betty could have sworn she felt the gentle touch of familiar hands braiding her hair, heard the echo of a lullaby sung in a voice she barely remembered but could never forget. "She knows," Patrick said with quiet certainty. "And she's not the only one watching. Look around, Betty. Really look." Betty followed his gaze and gasped at what she saw. The clearing wasn't empty, it was filled with the translucent forms of wolves from ages past, spirits drawn by the magnitude of what had occurred. She recognized some faces from the genealogy charts in the archives, members of the moon-marked bloodline who'd died centuries ago. But it was the figure standing directly in front of them that made Betty's breath catch. A woman with Betty's eyes and gentle smile, wearing a healer's robes that shimmered with silver light. "Hello, my precious girl," Sarah Williams said, her voice carrying the warmth of a mother's love across the barriers of death itself. "I'm so very proud of who you've become." Tears streamed down Betty's face as she reached toward her mother's spirit, feeling the brush of ethereal fingers against her cheek. "I'm sorry I couldn't protect you," Sarah continued. "Sorry you had to grow up believing the worst about me. But seeing you now, seeing what you've accomplished, it was all worth it." "Mama," Betty whispered, the word carrying 22 years of longing and loss. "You were the light I never deserved," Patrick said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "But somehow I found you anyway." Betty turned to him, seeing her own wonder reflected in his golden eyes. "And yet you still chose me. Every day you keep choosing me." Sarah's spirit smiled, her form already beginning to fade as the moment passed. "Love each other well," she said, her voice growing distant. "And remember, mercy is the strongest magic of all." The spirits dispersed like morning mist, leaving Betty and Patrick alone beneath the silver moon. But the presence of love, past, present, and future, lingered in the clearing like a benediction. "She's right, you know," Betty said, wiping away tears that sparkled like diamonds in the moonlight. "About mercy being the strongest magic." "Is that what this is?" Patrick asked, gesturing at the transformed pack, the healed divisions, the hope that hadn't existed a week ago. "Magic?" Betty considered the question seriously. "I think it's something simpler and more powerful than magic. I think it's what happens when we choose to see the best in each other instead of the worst." Patrick's lips curved in a smile that held all the warmth she'd first glimpsed the night he'd claimed her. "That might be the most divine truth you've spoken yet." Betty's laughter bubbled up from deep in her chest, not the bitter sound of someone who'd lost hope, but the joyous expression of someone who'd found her place in the world. The sound echoed across the clearing, warm and infectious, carrying none of the pain that had once defined her existence. This laughter was different from the cruel mockery that had once driven her to tears. It was the laughter of belonging, of love freely given and received, of second chances and new beginnings. As if summoned by the sound, howls rose from the village, not aggressive territorial calls, but expressions of pure contentment. The pack was settling down for the night, secure in the knowledge that they were protected not by fear and dominance, but by love and mutual respect. "Listen to that," Betty said wonderingly. "Have you ever heard anything so beautiful?" Patrick tilted his head, listening to the harmonious chorus that spoke of unity rather than hierarchy. "Never. It's like they're singing themselves to sleep." "We should go," Betty said, though she made no move to leave. "We have responsibilities now, pack business to attend to." "The pack business can wait until morning," Patrick replied firmly. "Tonight we're just Patrick and Betty, sitting under the moon and marveling at how our lives turned upside down in the span of a week." Betty curled against his side, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek. "Do you think we'll be happy? Really happy? Not just satisfied with duty and responsibility?" "I think," Patrick said, pressing a kiss to the crown of her head, "that we're going to be disgustingly, annoyingly, wonderfully happy. The kind of happy that makes other people roll their eyes and secretly wish they had what we have." Betty's laughter rang out again, pure and unrestrained. It echoed off the trees and danced on the night air, a sound of joy that would linger in the pack's collective memory for generations to come. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky with hints of rose and gold, the newly crowned Luna and her alpha mate made their way back to the village hand in hand. Behind them, the clearing settled into peaceful silence, marked forever as the place where rejection had been transformed into redemption, where fear had given way to love. The moon began to fade as the sun claimed the sky, but its blessing remained. In a pack that had learned to choose mercy over vengeance, compassion over cruelty, the light would never truly dim. And in the years to come, when children asked about the night their world changed, the elders would tell them about the Omega who became divine, the Alpha who loved without condition, and the laughter that replaced the tears. It was, they would say, the beginning of everything beautiful.